Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The frozen carcass of the bull moose lay gutted in a clearing 3 miles northeast of Rock Harbor, and Daniel Marsh knew immediately that something was wrong. Not wrong in the ordinary sense. Not wolves or poachers or even bear activity out of season. Wrong in a way that made his hands shake as he photographed the kill site. The Canon power shot struggling to focus in the flat February light filtering through the white pines. He'd been a ranger at Isle Royale National Park for 11 years since 1998, and he knew what animal predation looked like. This wasn't that. The moose's rib cage had been cracked open with methodical precision, every scrap of viscera removed, consumed with an efficiency that spoke of desperate hunger rather than natural feeding behavior. But it was the tracks that made Daniel's breath come shallow and quick in the -15 cold. They started as boot prints, size 7, maybe 8, the tread pattern of standard Merrell hiking boots, circling the moose in an obsessive spiral. Then, somewhere in that spiral, the prints changed, lengthened. The heel disappeared and the toe spread wide, and Daniel found himself following a trail that looked less human with every yard. He'd been tracking Jessica Howell for 6 hours now, since her emergency beacon had activated at 4:47 that morning. 23 years old, botanist from Michigan State conducting winter research on white cedar regeneration patterns. She'd been solo camping at Lane Cove for the past 12 days, checking in via satellite phone every 48 hours per protocol. Her last scheduled contact was 3 days overdue. The Motorola radio on Daniel's belt crackled with static, then cleared enough for Ranger Chen's voice to push through. "Marsh, you copy. Weather service upgraded to blizzard warning. You need to extract like an hour ago." Daniel pressed the transmit button, eyes still fixed on those impossible tracks. Found evidence at coordinates 47.9844 north, 88.9234 west. Moose kill, fresh, maybe 24 hours, following a trail. Daniel. Chen's voice carried a weight that went beyond professional concern. They'd worked together long enough that Chen knew Daniel's history, knew what had happened 3 years ago on the Greenstone Ridge Trail. "Don't do this. Not again. Wait for backup." "There won't be backup for 3 days minimum, not with this storm front, you know that." Daniel's voice sounded stranger to himself than he intended, hollow in the way of men who'd already made their decisions. "She's out here, Marcus, and she's in trouble." The radio hissed empty air. Then, "Your call, brother, but I'm logging this conversation. And Daniel, whatever you find, don't assume it's her. Don't assume anything." The transmission ended, leaving Daniel alone with the wind and the tracks and the memory of another winter, another search, another ranger who'd gone into the backcountry and come back wrong. Ranger Sarah Dietrich, his partner. His fault. He shouldered his pack, 70 pounds of cold weather survival gear, first aid, emergency beacon, flares, and followed the tracks deeper into the forest. The trail led him through terrain that grew increasingly difficult. Jessica's path, or what he had to keep believing was Jessica's path, taking routes that made no tactical sense. She bypassed a perfectly serviceable lean-to shelter, avoided a known freshwater spring marked on every topographic map, and instead headed straight toward the island's interior, toward the swampy lowlands near Siskiwit Lake, where the black spruce grew dense and the ice formed unpredictable pressure ridges. Daniel's GPS unit showed his position clearly enough. Isle Royale was only 45 miles long, 9 miles wide at its broadest point, an island wilderness suspended in Lake Superior's frigid waters. But the precision of the satellite coordinates did nothing to dispel the sensation of vastness, of being swallowed by something far larger and more ancient than himself. He found Jessica's first camp at dusk, tucked beneath a granite outcropping 200 yards from the lake's edge. The tent was still standing, but the front flap hung open, snapping in the wind with a sound like breaking bones. Daniel approached slowly, one hand on the canister of bear spray clipped to his belt, though he knew with absolute certainty that no bear had done this. Inside the tent, chaos. Jessica's sleeping bag had been shredded, the down insulation scattered like snow. Her backpack lay overturned, contents spilled across the frozen nylon floor. But it was the food situation that made Daniel's stomach contract. Every package of freeze-dried meals had been torn open and consumed. Not just opened, but consumed with a frenzy that left teeth marks in the plastic pouches. A week's worth of rations, minimum, devoured in what must have been a single sitting. Daniel found her field journal wedged beneath the sleeping pad, its pages stiff with cold. He opened it with gloved hands, using his headlamp to read the cramped handwriting. February 8, 2009, Day 7. Cedar regeneration data looking good. Counted 43 saplings in the northeast quadrant. Solid age distribution. Weather holding. Feeling strong. Might extend the study by a week. February 10th, Day 9. Appetite increasing. Burned through today's rations by noon. Could eat everything in my pack and still feel empty. Need to ration better. Keep thinking about meat. Red meat. Moose roast with blood gravy like Mom used to make. February 12th, Day 11. Can't stop eating. Something wrong with me. Ate entire 3-day supply yesterday. So hungry. Caught myself considering the dead rabbit I found by Siskiwit Bay. Raw, fresh. The hunger is a living thing inside me, growing, demanding. Need to get out. Can't radio. Batteries all dead. How are all the batteries dead? Need to walk to Rock Harbor, 20 miles. Can do it. But the forest keeps circling. Trees keep moving. Am I moving? Is the forest? The handwriting deteriorated after that, the entries becoming increasingly erratic, less coherent. February 14th. Hunger. Hunger. The Wendigo whispers an old Ojibwe, and I understand. I understand. It says I can stop hurting if I just. February 15th. Met him in the forest, tall as the trees, antlers like dead wood reaching for sky. He showed me what I am becoming, showed me the truth beneath skin. We are all meat, all hunger. The distinction is artificial. He is coming. He has always been coming. Since the first winter, since the first starvation, since the first moment someone looked at their companion and felt that terrible, necessary hunger. The final entry was dated yesterday. I am so hungry. 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 I am. The rest of the page was illegible, the pen having gouged completely through the paper. Daniel closed the journal, his own hands trembling. Not from cold. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, his breath crystallizing instantly in the beam of his headlamp. But the trembling came from somewhere deeper, from the part of him that recognized patterns, that remembered Sarah Dietrich's final radio transmission 3 years ago. There's something in the forest, Danny. Something old. And it's so hungry. They'd found Sarah 4 days later. What was left of her? The official report listed cause of death as exposure and hypothermia with complicating factors of psychotic break. The unofficial truth, whispered among the rangers who'd been on the recovery team, was that Sarah had consumed approximately 15 pounds of raw flesh in the hours before her death, moose tissue primarily. But there'd been other matter in her stomach, matter that DNA testing had very quietly identified as human. A park maintenance worker named Dennis Holbrook had gone missing the same week Sarah died. They never found Dennis. They never found much of him. Daniel hadn't slept properly in 3 years, hadn't trusted himself alone in the backcountry, hadn't forgiven himself for letting Sarah go out alone when she'd been acting strange, when she'd been complaining about constant hunger, about dreams of running through snow on all fours, about hearing voices in a language she didn't speak but somehow understood. Now it was happening again. He keyed his radio, knowing the storm would likely prevent transmission, but trying anyway. Chen, this is Marsh. I'm at Jessica Howell's camp. Situation is complicated. Subject shows signs of extreme psychological distress and possible malnutrition despite adequate food stores. Trail continues northwest toward Siskiwit Swamp. Am pursuing. Static answered him. The blizzard was closing in, the first heavy snowflakes beginning to fall. each one seeming to whisper as it landed. Daniel shouldered his pack and followed the tracks out of the camp, into the darkness, into the forest that waited with the patience of stone and the hunger of winter itself. The tracks led him deeper into territory he didn't recognize, though he'd hiked every marked trail on Isle Royale over the past 11 years. The forest had a different quality here, the trees growing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, creating corridors and clearings that guided him forward with subtle insistence. The black spruce stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches weighted with snow that never seemed to fall despite the wind. Daniel's headlamp caught movement ahead, a flash of blue fabric the color of standard-issue cold-weather research gear. He called out, "Jessica! Jessica Howell? I'm Ranger Daniel Marsh. I'm here to help you." His voice disappeared into the forest without echo, swallowed by the snow and the darkness and something else, some quality of the air itself that seemed to absorb sound. The blue fabric moved again, deeper into the trees. Daniel followed, his snowshoes breaking through the crust with each step, the sound impossibly loud in the muffled silence. He was breathing hard now, his chest tight not from exertion, but from the same mounting panic he'd felt during Sarah's search, the certainty that he was walking into something that had already decided his fate. He found Jessica's jacket first, draped over a low-hanging branch like an offering. Then her fleece layer, 20 yards further. Then her thermal shirt, frozen stiff. A trail of clothes leading deeper into the swamp. A breadcrumb path that Daniel knew he should not follow but followed anyway. Because that's what rangers did. Because that's what he'd done for Sarah. And maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time he could save someone. The tracks ended at a frozen beaver pond, the ice green-black and treacherous. On the far side, backlit by the moon breaking briefly through the storm clouds, stood a figure. She was naked from the waist up, her skin showing no signs of frostbite despite the lethal temperature. Jessica Howell, or what had been Jessica Howell, stood perfectly still on the ice, her arms hanging at her sides, her head tilted at an angle that suggested her neck might be broken. From this distance, Daniel could see her ribs pressing against her skin with skeletal prominence, see the way her spine curved like a bow, see how impossibly thin she'd become in the 12 days since her last supply check. "Jessica," Daniel called, his voice cracking. "I need you to move slowly toward me, away from the ice. Can you hear me?" The figure's head straightened with a sound like branches scraping together. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once, from the trees and the ice and the wind itself. "I can hear you, Daniel Marsh. I can hear your heartbeat. I can hear the blood moving through your veins like music, like the most beautiful song. I can hear your fear, and it smells like copper and salt, and I am so hungry." She took a step forward, and Daniel's headlamp caught her eyes. They reflected the light like an animal's, green and gold, and utterly empty of anything human. "That's not Jessica talking," Daniel said, fighting to keep his voice steady, remembering his training, remembering the folklore his Ojibwe liaison officer had once shared during a winter safety briefing. The Wendigo, the spirit of insatiable hunger that possessed humans who resorted to cannibalism, or who allowed themselves to be consumed by greed, by desire, by the gnawing emptiness that came from wanting more than the world could provide. "Jessica, if you're in there, you need to fight it. You need to..." "Fight?" The thing wearing Jessica's face laughed, and the sound was like ice cracking, like bones breaking, like the last breath leaving a frozen body. "Why would I fight? For the first time in my life, I'm not empty. For the first time, I understand what I am. What we all are. Just hunger-wearing skin, Daniel. Just temporary vessels for an appetite that will never, ever be satisfied." She moved across the ice with inhuman speed, closing the distance between them in 3 strides that should have been impossible, each footfall leaving a print that shifted from human to something else, something with too many joints and claws that scraped the ice like knives. Daniel stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the flare gun in his jacket pocket. The motion was clumsy with cold and terror, his fingers numb, his mind screaming at him to run while his training insisted he hold his ground, that rangers didn't abandon people in distress. But the thing moving toward him wasn't a person in distress. Not anymore. "I can smell her on you," Jessica Thing said, tilting her head again, studying him with those terrible reflective eyes. "Sarah, your partner." She's inside me, Daniel. Part of me. I consumed what the forest left. Found her scattered bones in a cave near Feltman Ridge. Cracked them open for the marrow. And when I tasted her memories. I know what she said to you before she died. I know what she asked you to do. Daniel's hand closed around the flare gun. That's not possible. Sarah was delicious, the Wendigo interrupted, Jessica's voice layering over something deeper, something that spoke in the scratching whisper of wind through dead branches. Every memory she had of you, every moment of trust and partnership and love. Yes, love, Daniel, she loved you and you never acknowledged it. All of that made her meat so much sweeter. And now you're here. And I'm so grateful because I'm still hungry. And you smell like guilt and grief, and those are the most filling flavors of all. The creature lunged. Daniel fired the flare gun without thinking, the phosphorescent projectile screaming between them, illuminating the forest in hellish red light. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound that seemed to come from dozens of throats at once. Jessica's human vocal cords overlaid with the bellowing of something massive and ancient, and recoiled from the light and heat. Daniel ran. He crashed through the forest without thought to direction or safety. His snowshoes tangling in the underbrush, his pack slamming against his back with each desperate stride. Behind him, the Wendigo pursued, and Daniel could hear the way it moved, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, sometimes with a sickening, scuttling sound that suggested too many limbs, a constantly shifting form that reflected the hunger's essential nature. Never satisfied, always transforming, forever seeking new ways to consume. His headlamp caught glimpses of it in the spaces between trees. Not Jessica anymore. Not entirely. Elongated limbs covered in frost-rimed skin pulled tight over impossible musculature. Antlers, actual antlers, bone-white and branching, had erupted from her skull, tearing through scalp and hair. Her jaw had unhinged, revealing rows of teeth that had never been designed for human mouths. Daniel's radio crackled back to life, Chen's voice cutting through with crystal clarity despite the storm. Daniel, emergency beacon activated. Your position shows... Jesus, you're in the swamp? Get out of there. The elders said never go into the swamp in winter. There are things that... The transmission cut off as the Wendigo caught up. It slammed into Daniel from behind, driving him face first into the snow. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, left him gasping and struggling, his hands scrabbling uselessly at the frozen ground. The weight on his back was immense, far heavier than Jessica's 120-pound frame should have been. The thing pressed down on him and Daniel felt breath, impossibly cold, smelling of rot and old meat against the back of his neck. I remember you, the Wendigo whispered. And now its voice was Sarah's voice, perfect and clear and exactly as Daniel remembered it. I remember how you wouldn't look at me, Danny. How you turned away every time I tried to reach you, tried to make you understand that I wanted more than partnership. I starved for you, Danny. Starved for your attention, your affection, your love. And when I died, I was so empty. But not anymore. Never again. Claws pricked through Daniel's jacket, through his layers of fleece and thermal underwear into the skin of his back. Not deep. Not yet. A promise of what would come. I could feel that emptiness inside you, Sarah Wendigo continued. The guilt, the grief, the space where your faith in yourself used to be. I could devour all of that pain, Danny. Make you part of me, part of us. There are 17 of us now, 17 rangers and hikers and researchers who came to this island seeking something and found only hunger. We could add you to our number, make you family. Daniel's hand found his knife, the Benchmade folder he'd carried for 15 years. Not much of a weapon against something that had once been human but had become winter and hunger and ancient evil given form. But it was what he had. He twisted, slashing upward with the blade, feeling it connect with something solid. The Wendigo shrieked and released him, ichor rather than blood pouring from the wound in its chest, black and viscous and steaming in the frozen air. Daniel scrambled to his feet, bringing the knife up in a defensive posture he'd learned from the urban survival course he'd taken after Sarah's death. After he'd promised himself he'd never be helpless again, the creature circled him, its movements becoming less human with each revolution. It walked on all fours now, its spine arching like a cat's, Jessica's face stretching and reforming, the skull beneath the skin reshaping itself into something that had never been meant for this world. "You can't kill hunger, Daniel," it said, its voice now a chorus of all its victims speaking in terrible harmony. "You can only feed it or become it. Which will you choose?" Daniel's mind raced through everything he remembered from the Ojibwe stories, from the folklore research he'd done obsessively after Sarah's death, searching for answers that made sense of the impossible. The Wendigo could be killed, in theory. Fire was said to work, burning the possessed body to ash and releasing the spirit. Silver was mentioned in some accounts, but mostly, the stories emphasized prevention, avoidance, and the importance of community in resisting the hunger's call. Alone, isolated, surrounded by darkness and snow and the patient malevolence of something that had fed on human suffering for generations, Daniel had none of those advantages. The Wendigo lunged again, and this time Daniel didn't try to fight it. Instead, he dropped, rolling to the side, letting the creature's momentum carry it past him. He came up running, heading not away from the lake but toward it, toward the thin ice and the dark water beneath. The Wendigo followed, howling now, its voice containing echoes of every victim it had consumed, every ranger who'd come to Isle Royale seeking peace and found only endless appetite. Jessica's voice was there, and Sarah's, and the voices of others Daniel didn't recognize but could imagine. Park visitors who disappeared over the years, names in incident reports, cold cases that had never been satisfactorily explained. Daniel hit the ice at full speed, his snowshoes distributing his weight just enough to keep from falling through immediately. The Wendigo, heavier and less cautious, crashed through the surface like a stone through glass. The thing shrieked, its cry splitting the night, as the frigid water of Lake Superior, even colder than the air, hovering just above freezing, engulfed it. Not because the water would kill it, Daniel knew. The Wendigo was already dead, already beyond the reach of normal physical harm. But water was purifying. Water remembered what it meant to be clean, to be untainted, to flow and change and never allow anything to take permanent hold. And Lake Superior was ancient water, glacier melt and stone-filtered water that had been here long before humans brought their hunger to this island. The ice cracked beneath Daniel's feet, spiderwebs of fracture spreading out from where the Wendigo had fallen through. He lunged for the shore, his fingers clawing at frozen mud and snow, his snowshoes kicking uselessly as the ice disintegrated behind him. He made it to solid ground and turned to look back. Jessica floated in the black water, her body small and human again, the terrible transformations receding. Her eyes, brown, normal, terrified, met Daniel's for just a moment. "Tell them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Tell them I tried to fight it. Tell them I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough." Then she sank beneath the surface, the water closing over her head with barely a ripple, and Daniel was alone on the shore with the storm and the darkness and the knowledge that he'd failed again. He activated his emergency beacon with numb fingers, then sat down in the snow to wait for extraction that wouldn't come for hours, maybe days. The storm was intensifying, the wind shrieking through the black spruce, and somewhere in that wind Daniel thought he could still hear voices, hungry voices, waiting voices. He'd carry Jessica out when the weather cleared, recover her body, write his report, attend the investigation. He'd tell them that she'd fallen through the ice while experiencing a psychotic episode brought on by malnutrition and isolation. Some of that would even be true. But he'd also carry the truth that no one else would believe, that Isle Royale held something old and patient and endlessly hungry, that 17 bodies lay scattered across this island, 17 rangers and visitors who'd heard the Wendigo's call and answered it, that the boundary between human and monster was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Just one desperate winter, one gnawing hunger, one moment of weakness away. And he'd carry the certainty, growing stronger with each passing minute as he sat alone in the storm, that he could still hear Sarah's voice in the wind, still hear her calling his name, still hear her promising that the hunger could end, that the emptiness could be filled, that he could stop running and finally Finally rest. The Rangers found Daniel 36 hours later, hypothermic but alive, sitting exactly where he'd activated his beacon. Jessica Howell's body was recovered from the beaver pond 3 days after that, once the weather cleared enough for the dive team to work safely. The official report listed cause of death as accidental drowning complicated by exposure. The autopsy noted significant weight loss and behavioral changes consistent with psychological distress, but made no mention of the scratch marks on the inside of her tent, the pattern of consumption that defied normal behavior, or the fact that her stomach contents included approximately 4 pounds of raw moose tissue. Daniel Marsh submitted his resignation effective immediately. He told Chen and the other rangers that he was done with backcountry work, done with Isle Royale, done with winters in isolation, and the sound of wind through dead trees. But he didn't tell them about the dreams that started the week after Jessica's recovery. Dreams where he stood in a frozen forest, surrounded by figures that had once been human, but were human no longer. Dreams where Sarah stood at the center of that circle, beautiful and terrible, her antlers branching toward a sky that held no stars. Dreams where she offered him her hand and promised that the guilt would end, the grief would end. The hunger that gnawed at him in the dark hours before dawn would finally, mercifully end. He didn't tell them that he'd started eating more, consuming twice his normal calories but never feeling satisfied. That food had lost all taste except for the ghost memory of copper and salt. That he'd caught himself more than once, standing at his freezer at 3 a.m, staring at the packages of raw meat, imagining what it would taste like fresh and warm and still bleeding. He especially didn't tell them about the night he woke up standing in his yard, barefoot in the snow, with no memory of how he'd gotten there, or the smear of blood on his hands that wasn't his own, or the neighbor's cat that had gone missing the same night. Daniel moved to Florida 6 months after Jessica Howell's death. Somewhere warm, somewhere that never saw snow, somewhere as far from Isle Royale as he could manage while staying in the continental United States. He took a job as a park ranger at Everglades National Park, telling himself that alligators and pythons were dangers he understood, dangers that didn't whisper in dead languages or promise to fill the emptiness inside him. But on winter nights, even in Florida where winter meant 70 degrees and sunshine, Daniel would wake from dreams of snow and hunger. He'd stand at his window looking north, feeling the pull of something vast and patient and endlessly, eternally hungry. And on those nights he understood with terrible clarity that Isle Royale hadn't let him go, that the Wendigo's hunger had followed him south, had taken root inside him, was waiting for the moment when his resistance finally broke. It was just a matter of time. Hunger, after all, was patient, and hunger always won. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moments scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Daniel. The radio crackled at 4:47 p.m., pulling Tom Brennan from thoughts he shouldn't have been having. He'd been staring at the Cathedral Grove cedar for the better part of 20 minutes, watching how the mist moved between its branches like something with intention, and thinking about Emma, always Emma. 8 years gone, and still the first thing his mind turned to in moments of silence, like a tongue probing the space where a tooth used to be. Base to Ranger Brennan. Tom, you copy? He lifted the Motorola to his lips, thumb finding the talk button through muscle memory. Go ahead, Diane. We've got a situation. Missing hiker, female, 26, Lauren Whitmore. Last contact was yesterday morning from the Hoh River Trail, about 8 miles in. Her PLB went active 2 hours ago near the Sol Duke Junction, but now we're getting nothing. Tom felt something settle in his chest, heavy and familiar. The Sol Duke Junction. He knew that area. Everyone who'd worked Olympic long enough knew it, though most wouldn't say why. What's her experience level? Considerable. This is her 4th solo backcountry trip this year. She filed proper permits, had the right gear. Her emergency contact, boyfriend back in Seattle, says she's meticulous about check-ins. He expected a satellite message at noon. Got nothing. Tom looked at his watch, an old Timex his father had given him before the cancer. Nearly 5 o'clock. In October, that meant maybe 90 minutes of decent light left, less under the canopy. I'm 40 minutes from the Hoh River trailhead. I can be at the 8-mile marker by dark if I push it. Negative. Weather Service is calling for heavy rain moving in after sunset. Temperature dropped to 38 degrees. We're organizing a full SAR response for first light. I need you to stage at the trailhead, interview any day hikers coming out, see if anyone saw her. He should have felt relief, should have been grateful for a night to prepare, to get his head straight before going into the forest after another lost soul. Instead, he felt that same pull he'd been fighting for 8 years, the one that whispered maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time he could actually bring someone home. Copy that. En route to Hoh River trailhead, Tom started his truck, a 2004 Ford Ranger that had seen better days, and pulled onto the narrow park road that wound through corridors of Sitka spruce and Douglas fir. The Hoh Rainforest section of Olympic got over 12 feet of rain a year, creating an ecosystem that felt prehistoric, suffocating. Moss grew on everything, rocks, fallen logs, the trees themselves, creating layers of green so deep they seemed to absorb sound. Emma had loved it here. She'd called it a fairy tale forest. She'd been 9 when the forest took her. No. Tom's hands tightened on the wheel. The forest didn't take her. A series of bad decisions took her. His decision to let her walk ahead on the trail, his decision to stop and adjust his pack, his decision to assume she'd stay in sight. The search had lasted 6 days. They'd found her jacket on the 4th day, snagged on a vine maple 100 yards off trail. Nothing else. No footprints, no blood, no body, just a small purple jacket with a broken zipper and a chocolate bar wrapper in the pocket. The review board had cleared him of negligence, but cleared wasn't the same as innocent. His wife Sarah had known the difference. She'd left within the year, remarried a dentist in Portland, started a new family with a man who didn't lose children in the woods. Tom had left the Park Service entirely, spent 5 years working construction in Tacoma, drinking too much, sleeping too little. Then last year, when a position opened at Olympic, he'd applied. Diane Reeves, the new district ranger, had known his history but hired him anyway. Sometimes the broken places make us stronger, she'd said. Tom wasn't sure he believed that, but he'd needed the job, needed to be back in the forest, needed to be where Emma had been last. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty when he arrived. Just 2 vehicles, both showing signs of recent use. Tom parked and grabbed his gear. High-powered LED flashlights, spare batteries, first aid kit, space blankets, water purification tablets, his personal Garmin GPS unit. The park-issued ones were better, but he'd learned to trust his own equipment. In 2009, GPS was still imperfect under heavy canopy, but it was better than nothing. A couple emerged from the trailhead as he approached, both in their 60s, faces flushed from exertion. Tom intercepted them near their Subaru. "Excuse me, folks. Ranger Brennan. Can I ask how far in you went today?" The man unslung his pack. "About 5 miles, turned back around 2. Why? Something wrong?" "Missing hiker. Woman, mid-20s, solo, would have been ahead of you. See anyone fitting that description?" The couple exchanged glances. The woman spoke up, her voice careful. "We didn't see anyone. Not going in, not coming out. But what?" "It was odd," she continued. "Around mile 4, maybe 4.5, we heard someone calling. A woman's voice, I think. Coming from south of the trail, deeper in the forest. We stopped, called back, but got no response. Thought maybe we'd imagined it, or it was a bird. The forest makes strange sounds." Tom felt that heaviness in his chest again. "What time was this?" "Maybe 1:30. We didn't think much of it at the time, but now..." She trailed off, looking worried. He took their contact information, assured them they'd done the right thing by reporting it, and watched them drive away. Then he stood in the parking lot as twilight thickened between the trees, staring at the trailhead sign. Show River Trail, 17.3 miles to Glacier Meadows. His phone buzzed, a text from Diane. "Full team assembling 600. Weather's going to be bad. Get rest." But Tom didn't drive back to his small apartment in Forks. Instead, he sat in his truck as darkness came on completely, watching the trailhead. He told himself he was maintaining a presence, being thorough. The truth was simpler. He couldn't leave. Somewhere in that forest was a young woman who'd trusted in her experience, her equipment, her careful planning. And the forest was teaching her the same lesson it had taught him 8 years ago, that none of that mattered when something wanted you lost. At 9:14 p.m., his radio crackled again. "Tom, you still at the trailhead?" Diane's voice carried an edge he didn't like. "Affirmative. I need you to come to the station now. We need to talk about something." 20 minutes later, Tom sat in Diane's office, looking at a map spread across her desk. Red pins dotted various locations throughout the park. There were 7 of them. "Lauren Whitmore is the 8th, Diane said quietly. She looked tired, older than her 50 years. 8 hikers in 18 months, all experienced, all properly equipped, all last seen or last signaling from areas within a 3-mile radius of this point. She tapped the map, her finger landing on a spot labeled Cedar Cathedral Grove. Tom stared at the map, something cold spreading through his gut. 8? Why didn't I know about this? Because I didn't want to start a panic. Because most of them have explanations. Falls, exposure, animals. Backcountry is dangerous. We lose people every year, but... She pulled out a folder, opened it. Inside were incident reports, search documentation, photos. Look at the pattern. All disappeared between October and March. All were solo hikers. All were within a day of the new moon. Tom picked up one of the reports. Marcus Chen, 31, experienced mountaineer. Last seen September 27, 2008. Found 3 weeks later, 12 miles from his planned route, dead from exposure. The report noted unusual disorientation based on his GPS track, which showed him walking in circles for hours before the device stopped transmitting. Another report, Jennifer Walsh, 38, wildlife biologist. Disappeared November 14, 2008. Never found. Her backpack discovered in a cedar grove, contents carefully arranged in a perfect circle. No sign of struggle, no tracks leading away. Jesus, Diane. This is... I know what it looks like. Serial killer, predator, something targeting backpackers. We've had FBI involvement, brought in behavioral analysts. They found nothing. No evidence of foul play beyond the disappearances themselves. And the ones we did find dead? She pulled out more photos. Autopsy results show death by natural causes consistent with getting lost and dying from exposure. Except what? She pulled out a final photo, and Tom's breath caught. It showed Marcus Chen's body as it had been found, curled against the base of an enormous cedar tree. But carved into the bark above him, crude and deep, were symbols Tom didn't recognize. Not graffiti, not English, something older. The coroner noted elevated cortisol levels suggesting extreme prolonged stress. But more than that, his brain showed unusual activity patterns even in death. The parts that process spatial recognition were lit up like he'd been actively trying to navigate right up until his heart stopped. Like he'd been lost in his own head. Tom set down the photo, his hands not quite steady. What are those symbols? We had a linguistics professor from UW look at them. She said they're similar to old Slavic runic alphabets, used in folk magic and protection rituals. This area, Salduck Valley, Cedar Cathedral Grove, there was a Polish logging community here in the 1890s. They cut the old growth until the park was established. Before they left, some of the oldest loggers made statements to local papers about forest spirits and old guardians that didn't want the trees cut. It was dismissed as superstitious nonsense. You're not seriously suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, Diane interrupted. I'm telling you that 8 experienced hikers have vanished or died in an isolated area of this park, all showing similar patterns of disorientation and all connected to a specific geographic location. I'm telling you that tomorrow we're sending a team into those woods to find Lauren Whitmore, and I need you to understand what you might be walking into. Tom looked at the map again, at those 7 red pins clustered around the Cedar Cathedral Grove. He thought about the couple's story, about a woman's voice calling from deep in the forest. He thought about Emma's jacket, found where no child should have been able to reach alone. "Why me?" he asked. "Why tell me this and not the full SR team?" Diane's expression softened. "Because you've been there before. Lost in those woods. Not physically, but in every way that matters. You know what it feels like when the forest stops making sense, when every direction looks the same, when you can't trust your own judgment anymore. That's what's happening to these hikers. Something in that grove disorients them, breaks them down. If we're going to find Lauren alive, we need someone who understands what that feels like and came back anyway." Tom wanted to argue, wanted to say that his experience was different, that losing Emma had nothing to do with some cursed patch of forest. But he couldn't make himself believe it. He'd been in these woods hundreds of times since returning, and there were places, certain groves, certain arrangements of trees, that made his skin prickle with recognition he couldn't explain. As if the forest remembered him, and he remembered it. "The search starts at 6 a.m., Diane said. "Weather's going to be hell. Rain, fog, temperature in the 30s. But Lauren's PLB activated, which means she triggered it manually. She knew she was in trouble. Maybe we can still reach her." Tom left the station at 10:47 p.m. He should have gone home, should have gotten sleep before the early start. Instead, he drove back to the Hoh River trailhead. The parking lot was empty now, just his truck in the darkness and the sound of rain starting to fall through the canopy. He sat there with his headlights pointing at the trail, illuminating the first 20 feet of path before it curved away into nothing. His phone showed 3 bars of signal, enough for a quick search. He typed in Lishi Slavic Forest Spirit and started reading. The entries were scattered, mostly academic papers and folklore collections, but the details aligned. The Leshi, or Leshi, was a protective entity of old forests, a shapeshifter that appeared as anything from a tree to a human to something in between. It ruled the animals, controlled the paths, and punished those who showed disrespect to the forest. Most accounts described it as capricious rather than evil, playing tricks on travelers, leading them in circles, making them forget which direction they'd come from. But some stories spoke of the Leshi claiming people entirely, absorbing them into the forest itself, where they became part of its eternal consciousness. The lost ones, the stories called them, neither dead nor alive, but somewhere between, walking paths that didn't exist for anyone else. Tom's hands shook as he set down his phone. He was thinking about Emma again, but different now. Not about the search, not about the jacket, but about the dreams he'd had for years after. Dreams where he was walking through the forest and heard her voice calling from somewhere he couldn't reach, somewhere just beyond perception. He'd always thought they were guilt, trauma, the mind's way of processing grief. But what if they'd been something else? The rain intensified, drumming on the truck's roof. Tom turned off his headlights and sat in complete darkness, listening. The forest at night was never truly silent. There were always sounds, small movements, the whisper of wind through branches. But tonight something felt different. The sounds seemed to follow a rhythm, almost like breathing. And beneath the rain, beneath the wind, he thought he could hear something else. A voice, maybe. Or many voices, all speaking at once, in a language he couldn't understand, but that made every primitive part of his brain scream to get out, to drive away, to never come back. He didn't leave. Instead, he reclined his seat and closed his eyes, knowing he wouldn't sleep but needing to rest anyway. At some point in the early morning hours, the rain stopped. In the sudden quiet, Tom opened his eyes and looked at the trailhead. Something was standing there, just barely visible in the ambient light from the clouded moon. Tall and thin and wrong somehow, its proportions not quite matching anything human or animal. It stood perfectly still, and Tom couldn't tell if it was facing toward him or away. He grabbed his flashlight, hands fumbling for the switch. By the time he got it on and pointed at the trailhead, nothing was there. Just the wooden sign and the trail markers and the first few feet of path disappearing into darkness. He told himself it had been a shadow, a trick of the light, nothing real, but his hands kept shaking, and when he checked his watch it was 5:23 a.m., almost time for the team to assemble. Tom drove back to the ranger station through dawn light that seemed too thin, too gray. The SAR team was gathering when he arrived, 12 people total, including 2 dog handlers with German Shepherds trained for live search. Tim Rodriguez, the lead SAR coordinator, was distributing assignments when Tom walked into the briefing room. "Brennan, good. You're on Team A with me, Sarah Chen, and Max with his dog Luna. We're taking the main trail to the 8-mile point where Lauren's PLB activated, then working a grid pattern south." He pointed at the map. "Teams B and C will sweep north and west. We've got air support on standby if the weather clears, but forecast shows fog all day." The briefing continued, covering standard search protocols, radio check-in times, safety procedures. But Tom noticed what wasn't being discussed. The pattern Diane had shown him, the other disappearances, the symbols carved into bark. Everyone in this room knew something was wrong with this section of forest, but no one wanted to say it aloud. As if speaking, the fear would make it more real. They reached the trailhead at 6:45 a.m. and started in. The Ho River Trail was well maintained, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, marked every quarter mile. It should have been straightforward. But within the first mile, Tom felt that familiar prickling awareness, the sense that the forest was paying attention. Luna, the search dog, kept looking off trail, ears pricked forward, a low whine building in her throat. "She's tracking something," Max said, but he didn't sound happy about it. "Not human scent, though. Something else." They pushed on. At mile 3, they found the first sign, a protein bar wrapper, the brand matching Lauren's gear list. It was placed carefully on a flat rock beside the trail, weighed down with a small stone. Not dropped, not discarded. Positioned. "She left a marker," Sarah Chen said. She was Marcus Chen's younger sister, had joined the SAR team after his death. Tom hadn't realized she'd be on this search until now. She knew she was getting disoriented, wanted to leave breadcrumbs. But the wrapper pointed south, off-trail, toward the Cedar Cathedral Grove. Tim consulted his GPS. PLB last activated about 4 miles that direction, near the old growth cedars. But that's rough terrain, no maintained paths. They moved off-trail, pushing through sword ferns and over fallen logs slick with moss. The canopy thickened, blocking what little light the overcast sky provided. Within 15 minutes, Tom had lost all sense of direction. His GPS showed they were heading south-southwest, but his instincts screamed they were going in circles. The trees looked the same fallen logs, the same configurations of stones. At one point, he was certain they'd passed the same nurse log 3 times, but his GPS track showed a straight line. "Hold up," Max said. Luna had stopped, refusing to go forward. The dog was staring at something ahead, hackles raised, that whine turning into a low growl. She's never done this before, not with any live track. Tim moved forward, scanning the area. Then he stopped. "Oh, Christ." Tom came up beside him and saw what had made Tim's voice change. The trees ahead formed a perfect circle, maybe 50 feet in diameter, their trunks grown impossibly close together. At the center of the circle was a raised platform of earth, and on that platform stood a single ancient cedar, so massive it would have taken 10 people holding hands to encircle its trunk. Carved into that trunk, covering every inch of bark Tom could see, were the same symbols from the photo Diane had shown him, but these were older, deeper, some of them almost healed over by the tree's growth. The air in the clearing smelled wrong, sweet and rotten at the same time, like overripe fruit and decay. And on the ground before the ancient cedar, arranged in that same careful pattern Jennifer Walsh's belongings had been found in, were Lauren Whitmore's things. Her backpack, her jacket, her GPS unit, still powered on, showing her last recorded position as this exact spot, her hiking boots unlaced and placed side by side. But no Lauren. "She wouldn't have left her boots," Sarah whispered. "No experienced hiker would take off their boots in terrain like this. Your feet would be shredded in minutes." Tim was on the radio, calling in the Discovery, requesting additional teams. But Tom wasn't listening. He was looking at the tree, at those symbols, and something was clicking into place in his mind. Not understanding exactly, but recognition. The same way he'd recognized Emma's jacket even before he saw the broken zipper. The same way he'd known on some level that she was gone before they'd called off the search. Luna started barking, sharp and frantic. Max struggled to hold her lead. She's tracking something, but it's not making sense. She keeps trying to go. The dog lunged forward, pulling Max off balance. The lead slipped from his hands, and Luna bolted, not toward the forest, but toward the tree. She stopped at the base of that ancient cedar and began digging, claws tearing at the earth, still barking that same desperate warning. "Max, get your dog," Tim started to say, but then the forest went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Every sound. The distant river, birds, the rustle of wind, cut off as if someone had closed a door. In that silence, Tom heard something else. Breathing. Deep and slow and all around them, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The kind of breathing a mountain might make, or a forest, or something so large that its respiratory cycle measured in minutes instead of seconds. The tree moved, not swaying in wind, moving. Its branches shifted with intention, curling inward. The symbols carved into its bark began to glow with a faint phosphorescent light, green like foxfire. And from somewhere deep within the tree's trunk came a sound that might have been wood creaking, or might have been laughter. "Back to the trail," Tim said, his voice steady but urgent. "Everyone back to the trail right now." They ran. At least Tom thought they were running back the way they'd come. But the forest had changed. Trees that should have been landmarks were gone. The terrain was steeper, rockier. His GPS showed them heading southwest, then south, then east, the arrow spinning wildly. Sarah fell, caught herself on a fallen log, and when she stood up she was staring at something Tom couldn't see. "Marcus?" she said softly. "Marcus, what are you—" Tim grabbed her arm. "There's nothing there. Keep moving." But Tom had seen it too, just for a second. A figure between the trees, tall and thin, its head crowned with what might have been antlers or branches. It watched them with eyes that were too large, too knowing, and when it smiled, its teeth were made of bark and stone. They burst back onto the main trail, somehow impossibly because Tom would have sworn they'd been running deeper into the forest. The silence broke like a dam bursting, all the normal sounds of the forest crashing back in. Max was on his hands and knees, vomiting. Sarah was crying quietly, repeating her brother's name. Tim was on the radio, trying to explain what had happened, but the words weren't working, because there weren't words for what they'd seen. Tom looked back toward the grove. The forest looked normal now, just trees and ferns and moss. But he knew what was there, had known for 8 years without being able to admit it. The Leshy, the forest guardian, the thing that took people who went too deep, who showed disrespect, who trespassed on ground that predated human understanding. Lauren Whitmore had walked into its territory, and it had claimed her the same way it had claimed Emma, claimed Marcus Chen, claimed all the others. Not killed them, claimed them, made them part of the forest's eternal awareness, lost ones walking paths between what was and what could never be. The search officially ended at 3:47 p.m. when the weather turned dangerous, freezing rain and dropping visibility to less than 50 feet. They recovered Lauren's belongings but found no body, no tracks, no blood. The official report would list her as missing, presumed dead from exposure, though the area would be searched again when conditions improved. Tim, Sarah, and Max all gave statements describing disorientation, possible carbon monoxide exposure from a ground vent, stress-induced hallucination. None of them mentioned what they'd really seen because speaking it would mean believing it, and believing it would mean accepting that some places in the world operated by rules older and stranger than human comprehension. Tom sat in Diane's office that evening, looking at the map with its red pins. She'd added an 8th pin, marking where they'd found Lauren's gear. "There's a pattern in the pattern," he said quietly. "Look at the dates. The disappearances cluster around the new moon, but more specifically, they're all within 3 days of when the moon enters its dark phase. And the locations, they're not random. They're spiraling inward toward that grove, each disappearance closer than the last. Whatever is there, it's been reaching outward, expanding its territory, Diane studied the map for a long moment. Then she pulled out a file Tom hadn't seen before, this one older. The paper yellowed. In 1897, the last of the Polish loggers left this area. Before they did, one of them, a man named Stanisław Kowalski, gave an interview to the Port Angeles newspaper. He said the forest had woken up angry after years of cutting, that the old Leshy was reclaiming what had been stolen. He said they'd made offerings, carved protection symbols, tried to appease it. But it wasn't enough. He said the forest wanted life, not just respect. It wanted the lost ones to remember it. Where is this file from? County Historical Society. I started digging after the third disappearance. Tom, I think whatever happened in the 1890s when they clear-cut that area, I think they damaged something, released something, or maybe just pissed it off. And it's been taking payment ever since, a little at a time. People who wander too deep, who show the wrong kind of confidence. The forest is teaching them the same lesson it taught those loggers, that we're temporary and it's eternal. Tom thought about his dreams, about Emma's voice calling from somewhere beyond reach. What if they're not dead? He asked. What if they're still there, just walking different paths? The lost ones? Then they're beyond our ability to save, Diane said quietly, and the kindest thing we can do is stop sending people in after them. But Tom couldn't do that. Over the next 3 weeks, he returned to the Hoh River Trail 6 times, always alone, always during daylight, never going off trail. He told himself he was maintaining the route, checking for hazards, doing his job. The truth was that he was listening for Emma's voice, for Lauren's, for any of them. And sometimes in the moments between bird calls in the silence before the wind started, he thought he heard them. Not calling for help, but calling him deeper, inviting him to understand what they understood now, to see what they saw. On his 7th visit, on a gray December morning with frost coating the moss, Tom walked 8 miles in and stood at the point where the trail came closest to the Cedar Cathedral Grove. He didn't go off trail. He'd learned that much. But he stood there for an hour, maybe more, listening to the forest breathe. And then he heard her. Emma. Not her voice as it had been, but changed somehow, layered with other voices, all of them speaking in unison. Daddy, they said, why don't you come home? Tom's vision blurred. His hand was reaching for his radio, ready to call Diane, ready to tell her he was going off trail, that he'd found something. But another part of him, the part that had survived 8 years of grief and guilt, knew that was the Leshy speaking. Knew that the invitation was real, that if he stepped off that trail he would find Emma and Lauren and all the others, would become lost with them in that eternal forest where time moved differently, and human concepts like life and death were just approximations of something more complex. His hand fell away from the radio. He stood there a moment longer looking into the forest, seeing shadows move between trees that might have been wind or might have been something else. Then he turned and walked back to the trailhead, each step feeling heavier than the last, each breath burning in his lungs like drowning. He didn't return after that. He requested a transfer to the park's administrative office, away from field work, away from the trails. Diane approved it without question. Other rangers took over his patrol routes, and life in Olympic National Park continued, as it always had, as it always would. The forest did what forests do, grew, changed, persisted. And sometimes people got lost in it, because that's what happens in wild places where human beings are only visiting and never truly in control. Tom kept the dreams, though, kept hearing Emma's voice in quiet moments, kept feeling the pull of that grove like gravity, like magnetism, like love and loss twisted into something older than either word. He learned to live with it the way you learn to live with any chronic wound, aware of it always, managing it daily, knowing it would never fully heal. But on nights when the moon went dark and rain drummed against his windows, Tom would sometimes drive to the Hoh River trailhead and sit in his truck, headlights pointed at the trail, listening. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he would see figures standing at the edge of the light. Tall and thin, and too many of them, all with eyes that reflected the headlights like animals, all perfectly still. They never approached. They just stood there, waiting, patient as trees, old as stone, the lost ones, the forest's eternal congregation, waiting for him to finally stop resisting, to finally come home. He never did, but he never stopped feeling the invitation either. That was the real horror, Tom came to understand. Not that the forest took people, but that part of him wanted to be taken, wanted to stop fighting, to finally let go, to find Emma in whatever place she existed now. The Leshy didn't need to hunt him because it had already claimed the part that mattered. His peace, his certainty that the world made sense, his ability to trust that when someone vanished into the wilderness, it was just bad luck and human error, nothing more. Some searches don't end. Some things that are lost stay lost. And some forests remember every person who ever walked beneath their trees, keep them forever in the space between one breath and the next, in the silence that comes before the wind starts, in the dreams of those left behind who can't stop listening for voices that shouldn't exist anymore but do. Tom Brennan knew that now. He would know it for the rest of his life, and on the day he finally died, years later in a hospital bed far from the forest, his last words would be a name spoken to empty air, answered by a sound like wind through branches, like breathing, like recognition. The forest always remembers. The forest always calls you home. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what really happened to the lost ones. Rebecca Miller's doctorate in cultural anthropology had prepared her for academic debates about the spiritual practices of the ancestral Puebloans. But the National Park Service hadn't hired her for her dissertation on Anasazi burial customs. They'd hired her because she could read a topographic map in the dark and hadn't panicked when a black bear wandered into her camp during training. Still, when the static-laced voice crackled through her radio at 4:17 a.m. on October 12, 2008, requesting her specifically for a missing person case at Canyon de Chelly, she felt the old academic instincts surface. Someone at the ranger station remembered her background. The October air carried that particular high desert cold that made her joints ache as she drove her Park Service Ford Ranger down Highway 191. The sky above northeastern Arizona was that pre-dawn purple-black that made the sandstone formations look like the bones of something ancient and massive. Her headlights caught the reflective eyes of a coyote standing beside the road near the Chinley turnoff. It didn't move as she passed, just watched with that unnerving stillness that coyotes sometimes had. Rebecca's hands tightened on the wheel. She'd been stationed at Canyon de Chelly for 8 months now, and the local Navajo staff had taught her enough to know that some signs shouldn't be ignored. But she was a scientist first, even if she wore a ranger's uniform. The missing person was Ethan Cooper, 23, graduate student in archaeology from the University of New Mexico. His advisor had reported him overdue by 16 hours. Ethan had been conducting preliminary research for his thesis on Anasazi agricultural practices, though the official permits showed he'd been assigned to catalog pottery shards at the visitor center. The discrepancy made Rebecca's trained mind catch on details. Students didn't just wander off into restricted areas of a national monument by accident. They went deliberately, usually because they'd found something more interesting than what their official assignments offered. She met Senior Ranger Thomas Begay in the pre-dawn darkness of the monument headquarters. Thomas was Navajo, 52, with the kind of weathered face that came from 3 decades of high desert sun. He handed her a styrofoam cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since midnight. "His truck is at the White House Overlook trailhead," Thomas said, spreading a topographic map across the hood of his vehicle. "We found it at 2:30 a.m. after his advisor called. Keys still in the ignition, driver's door open. His backpack was in the bed, water bottles, notebooks, camping gear all accounted for. The only thing he took with him was a Motorola 2-way radio, a GPS unit, and a camera." Rebecca studied the map, her fingers tracing the canyon's elevation lines. The White House Trail is easy, well marked, popular with tourists. Why would search and rescue call me at 4 in the morning for someone who's probably just twisted an ankle? Thomas's expression shifted, something Rebecca had learned to recognize over the past months. It was the look he got when Anglo Rangers asked questions that required answers the Park Service manual didn't provide. He pulled a small digital voice recorder from his pocket, the kind researchers used for field notes. We found this in his truck, under the seat. The advisor didn't know he had it. He pressed play. The recording started with ambient sound, wind, the rustle of fabric, footsteps on stone. Then Ethan's voice, breathless with either exertion or excitement. October 11th, 10:47 p.m. I'm approximately half a mile south of the White House ruins, elevation 5,680 feet. I found the site. Jesus Christ, I actually found it. The oral histories were accurate. There's a sealed chamber in the cliff face hidden behind a rock fall that looks natural but isn't. I can see tool marks. The entrance is... A pause. Longer than necessary. When Ethan's voice returned, it had changed. Flatter. There's something here, not at the site, behind me. I thought it was another researcher at first, but... Static obscured the next few words. Walking wrong. Its legs bend. The knees are facing the wrong direction. And it's wearing... More static. Gotta be 8 feet tall on 2 legs, but it's not standing like a person stands. It's... The recording dissolved into white noise, then cut to a new timestamp. 3:47 a.m. This time, Ethan's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible over harsh breathing. If anyone finds this, don't come looking for me in the canyon. Whatever I saw, it's not alone. They're in the ruins, multiple. They sound like people calling my name, but the mouths don't move right. One of them has my voice. I can hear myself calling from the darkness, but I'm here. I'm hiding, A sound in the background, something between a coyote's yip and human laughter. Oh God, it knows where I am. It's smiling. People don't smile like that. People don't... The recording ended with a sound like the device being dropped, then nothing. Rebecca felt her coffee turning acidic in her stomach. She looked at Thomas, who was watching her with that careful expression again. You know what this sounds like, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I know what I'm not supposed to say in an official Park Service capacity, Thomas replied. And I know that 3 other hikers have reported seeing something in the canyon over the past 2 weeks. All of them described it the same way. Tall, moving wrong, wearing animal skins. Park Service called it mass hysteria, reflection of campfire stories tourists tell each other. He paused. But those 3 hikers were Navajo, from Chinle. They don't tell those stories to tourists. Rebecca knew the word he wasn't saying. She'd heard it whispered among the Navajo staff, always in tones that carried generations of genuine fear. Yi nald lu shi. The literal translation was, with it, he goes on all 4s. But the English word that had lodged itself in popular culture carried its own weight. Skinwalker. Her academic training wanted to classify it as folklore, a cultural narrative meant to enforce taboos against witchcraft and grave desecration. But standing in the pre-dawn cold with that recording echoing in her mind, Rebecca felt the uncomfortable friction between what she'd been taught to believe and what her instincts were screaming. The official search starts at 6 a.m. with the SAR team from Flagstaff, Thomas said. But you and I both know that if something happened to that kid in the dark, 6 a.m. might be too late. I need someone who understands why he went into those ruins. Someone who knows what he was looking for. Rebecca understood. Ethan Cooper hadn't just been cataloging pottery shards. He'd been hunting for something specific, something that oral histories mentioned but academic sources dismissed. The Navajo elders spoke of sealed chambers in Canyon de Chelly, places where the ancestral Puebloans had hidden their dead during times of great sickness, places that were supposed to stay sealed. Her dissertation advisor had called such stories cultural memory of pandemic response, stripped of supernatural significance through academic language. But Rebecca had spent enough time in the field to know that sometimes folklore preserved truths that science had forgotten. She nodded. I'll need a radio, extra batteries, and a detailed geological survey map of the canyon system. The tourist maps don't show the unstable areas. Thomas already had them ready. They took separate vehicles down the road that wound along the canyon's south rim, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to that particular shade of orange-pink that made the sandstone glow like embers. Canyon de Chelly was a Y-shaped system carved by the Rio de Chelly over millions of years, creating sheer walls that rose 800 feet in places. The ancestral Puebloans had built their dwellings in the alcoves and caves that erosion had carved into the cliff faces, creating cities that clung to vertical stone. Most tourists saw the White House ruins, one of the most photographed archaeological sites in the Southwest, and never ventured deeper into the canyon system where older, more mysterious structures waited in shadow. Rebecca parked beside Ethan's truck at the trailhead, a silver Toyota Tacoma, relatively new, with New Mexico plates and a university parking sticker on the rear window. She pulled on her leather gloves and searched the vehicle more thoroughly than the initial responders had. The backpack Thomas mentioned was indeed there. A North Face pack containing a camelback with 2 liters of water, energy bars, a first aid kit, notebooks filled with sketches of pottery designs, and a well-worn copy of a book titled Oral Histories of the Diné Sacred Sites of Canyon de Chelly. Rebecca flipped through it, finding passages highlighted in yellow marker. One section made her stop. The Chamber of the Wrapped Ones exists south of Tseyi, where the ancestors sealed those who died when the flesh-eating sickness came. The entrance bears the sign of the bear claw, and those who disturb the Wrapped Ones invite the attention of the Nald Lushi, who guard the boundaries between the living and the dead. She photographed the page with her digital camera, a Canon PowerShot that the Park Service had issued her, and continued searching. Under the driver's seat, wedged beside where the voice recorder had been, she found a folded piece of paper. It was a photocopy of a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed, showing the canyon system with annotations in tight handwriting. Someone, presumably Ethan, had marked a location approximately 0.7 miles south of the White House ruins with a red X and the note, "Bear Claw Petroglyphs, matches description. Possible sealed entrance." Thomas appeared beside her truck, already dressed for a canyon descent. Hiking boots, tactical pants with knee pads, a radio clipped to his vest. "Find something?" Rebecca showed him the map. His jaw tightened. "That area isn't on any official trail. The rock is unstable and it's sacred ground. We don't allow permits for that section." "Which is exactly why a graduate student looking to make his reputation would go there," Rebecca said. She felt the familiar academic thrill despite the circumstances, the possibility of discovery, of finding something that would rewrite understanding. Then she remembered the recording, the fear in Ethan's voice, and the thrill curdled into something colder. "We need to get down there before the sun gets too high. If he's injured..." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew that October nights in the high desert could drop below freezing, and Ethan had been missing for more than 12 hours. The descent into Canyon de Chelly required technical skills most tourists didn't possess. The White House Trail was deceptively easy, switchbacks and maintained steps leading to the canyon floor. But once down, navigating the sandy wash and avoiding unstable talus slopes required experience. Rebecca had spent months learning the canyon's geography, understanding how summer monsoons could transform dry washes into deadly flash floods within minutes, how the morning sun created shadows that hid dangerous drop-offs. They reached the canyon floor as full dawn broke, painting the sandstone walls in shades of rust and amber. The Rio de Chelly was mostly dry this time of year, just a thin stream meandering through cottonwoods whose leaves had turned yellow with autumn. The air smelled of sage and that particular mineral scent of ancient rock. Rebecca checked her GPS unit, a Garmin E-Trex that showed their position as a blinking dot on a pixelated screen. The technology was primitive compared to what would come later, but it was reliable. They were 0.3 miles north of Ethan's marked location. "We need to move quietly from here," Thomas said, his voice low. "And Rebecca, if you see anything unusual, anything at all, you tell me immediately. Don't investigate alone. Don't try to rationalize it, just tell me. You think the stories are real?" It wasn't a question. Thomas looked at her with eyes that had seen 3 decades of things the Park Service never put in official reports. "I think there are things in this canyon older than the Puebloans. I think the Navajo have words for them because we've learned what happens when you don't have words for danger. And I think that boy disturbed something that should have stayed undisturbed." They walked in silence after that, following the sandy wash south. The canyon walls rose higher here, creating a corridor of shadow that the morning sun hadn't reached. Rebecca's training made her observe everything: the geology, the vegetation patterns, the evidence of seasonal water flow. But underneath the scientific observation, something primitive in her hindbrain was screaming about the quality of the silence. No bird calls, no insects. Even the sound of their footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick. The petroglyphs appeared on a section of canyon wall that curved inward, creating a natural alcove. They were older than the ancestral Puebloan structures, likely left by the archaic peoples who'd inhabited the canyon system thousands of years before agricultural societies arose. Among the typical spirals and geometric patterns, Rebecca spotted what Ethan had been looking for: a series of 3 deep gouges in the stone, each at least a foot long, arranged in a pattern that resembled claw marks, the bear claw sign. Below the petroglyphs, a section of the cliff face showed signs of deliberate alteration. What appeared to be a natural rockfall was actually carefully placed stones, probably weighing several tons combined, fitted together to seal what Rebecca's trained eye recognized as a chamber entrance. The fit was so precise that it had survived centuries of weathering. But now someone had disturbed it. Recent tool marks scarred the stone around the edges, and several smaller rocks had been pried loose, creating a gap approximately 2 feet wide. "He didn't just find it," Rebecca whispered. "He opened it." Thomas's hand moved to the radio on his vest, but he didn't key it yet. His eyes were scanning the alcove, the surrounding canyon walls, the cottonwood trees nearby, looking for something. Rebecca felt her heartbeat accelerate, a response she couldn't entirely attribute to exertion. She approached the gap in the sealed entrance, pulling a flashlight from her belt, a mag light that felt reassuringly solid in her grip. The beam cut through the darkness beyond the stones, revealing a narrow passage that descended into the cliff. The walls were natural stone, but the floor had been deliberately smoothed, and she could see the remnants of wooden support beams that had rotted away centuries ago. The air that escaped from the gap carried a smell that made her recoil, not decomposition exactly, but something organic and wrong, like preserved meat that had been sealed away from oxygen for too long. "Ethan!" she called into the darkness. Her voice echoed strangely, as if the passage twisted in ways the sound couldn't follow properly. "Ethan Cooper, this is the National Park Service. If you can hear me, respond." Nothing. Then from deep within the passage, a sound. Scratching. Something moving against stone. And underneath it, so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, a voice that might have been human. "Help me, please. I'm stuck." Rebecca's radio crackled with static, though Thomas hadn't transmitted. She looked back at him and saw that his expression had gone completely neutral, the look of someone deliberately controlling their reaction. "Don't go in there," he said quietly. "If he's injured." "Rebecca." Thomas's voice carried an authority that transcended their equal rank. "Listen to what you're hearing. Really listen." She turned back to the gap, forcing herself to analyze the sound beyond instinctive response. The voice came again. "Help me. Please, I'm stuck." The exact same words, the exact same inflection. Not a cry of pain or fear, but a recording, a mimicry. And underneath it, that scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like something with claws testing the dimensions of a space it wanted to exit. The academic part of Rebecca's mind tried to classify what she was experiencing. Acoustic phenomena in enclosed spaces could create strange effects. The fear response triggered by unfamiliar environments could cause auditory pareidolia, hearing human voices in random sounds. But she'd spent 8 months in this canyon, had explored dozens of archaeological sites, and nothing had ever made her skin feel like it was trying to crawl off her body the way it did now. "We need to call this in," she said, backing away from the gap. "Get the full SAR team, proper equipment, maybe even—" The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. Rebecca's flashlight beam still penetrated the gap, illuminating perhaps 10 feet of the passage before it curved out of sight. Nothing moved in the circle of light, but she had the overwhelming sensation of being watched, not from inside the passage but from behind. The feeling was so intense that she spun, flashlight beam cutting across the alcove, the canyon wall, the cottonwood trees, and caught something moving behind the trees. Tall. Too tall to be human, even accounting for perspective. It dropped to all fours in a motion that was too fluid, too fast, bones bending in ways that created angles human joints couldn't achieve. Then it was gone, disappeared into the shadows so quickly that Rebecca's mind struggled to process what her eyes had seen. "Did you?" she started. "Yes." Thomas's hand was on his radio now, his other hand moving to his service weapon. "We're leaving. Now. Stay close to me, don't run, and for God's sake don't look back." They moved back along the wash at a brisk walk that wanted desperately to become a sprint. Rebecca's scientific training warred with the primal part of her brain that had kept her ancestors alive on the African savanna. She wanted to analyze what she'd seen, to rationalize it, to fit it into frameworks of known biology and physics. But Thomas's fear was real, and he was a man who'd spent his entire life in this landscape. If he was afraid, there were reasons beyond superstition. The sound came from ahead of them. A voice calling from the canyon walls. "Rebecca! Thomas! Over here!" It was perfectly calibrated to carry urgency without panic, the kind of call an injured hiker would make upon seeing rescue. Except they could see the entire stretch of canyon ahead, and there was no one there. "Keep walking," Thomas said. "Don't respond." The voice came again, closer now, from somewhere among the talus slopes to their right. "I found him. Ethan's over here. He needs help." Still that perfect calibration, that false urgency. And Rebecca realized with a sick lurch that the voice was hers. Not similar, not close, it was exact, down to the slight Colorado accent she'd never quite lost. The particular way she pronounced certain vowels. Something was speaking with her voice. Thomas keyed his radio, keeping his voice steady. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Begay. We have a potential hazard situation in Canyon de Chelly, South Sector. Requesting immediate extraction and full SAR deployment. Advise all teams to approach with extreme caution and maintain radio contact at all times." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy that, Ranger Begay. What's the nature of the hazard?" Thomas exchanged a look with Rebecca. How did you tell dispatch that something in the canyon was mimicking human voices? That the folklore the Park Service dismissed as cultural narrative was manifesting in ways that made your hands shake? "Wildlife encounter," he said finally. "Potentially dangerous. We're returning to the rim." They reached the base of the White House Trail, where the maintained path began its switchback ascent to the canyon rim. Rebecca felt marginally safer here, surrounded by the evidence of human infrastructure. The wooden posts marking the trail, the interpretive signs explaining the archaeological significance of the ruins. Civilization. But when she looked back at the canyon behind them, she saw something that made her stop. There were figures on the canyon walls, at least 3 of them, spread across different elevations, all perfectly still. They were too far away for her to see details, but their proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, bodies too narrow, heads cocked at angles that suggested observation. They didn't move, didn't react to being seen. They just watched. "Don't stop," Thomas said, his hand on her shoulder, pulling her toward the trail. "They want you to stop. They want you to look." Rebecca climbed. Her legs burned, her lungs protested the exertion at 5,900 feet elevation, but she climbed. Behind them, following at a distance that never quite closed, she could hear the sound of footsteps. Not paws, feet. But the rhythm was wrong, the gait all wrong, like something that understood bipedal locomotion, but hadn't quite mastered the biomechanics of it. They were halfway up when the smell hit. That same wrong organic scent from the sealed chamber, but stronger now, mixed with something animal. Rebecca made the mistake of glancing back and saw it clearly for the first time. 8 feet tall, maybe more, standing fully upright on legs that bent backward at the knees like a bird's. It wore the hide of a coyote. The pelt stretched and distorted across a frame that was nothing like a coyote's body. The head, God, the head, was the worst part. The coyote's skull was worn like a mask, but through the eye sockets Rebecca could see something else looking out. Something that had human features arranged in configurations that made her brain reject the image as impossible. It smiled at her. The coyote skull didn't move, but underneath it, through it, something smiled with too many teeth arranged in too many rows. Then it opened its mouth, and Ethan Cooper's voice came out, still carrying that undergraduate enthusiasm despite everything. "I found the chamber of the wrapped ones. Come see. You have to document this." Rebecca's legs nearly gave out. Only Thomas's grip on her arm kept her moving. "It's not him," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Whatever it's saying, whoever it sounds like, it's not them. The dead don't speak. Only things that eat the dead do." They reached the rim as the sun hit its zenith, flooding the canyon with light that should have felt safe. The thing didn't follow them beyond the trail's end. Rebecca collapsed beside their vehicles, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't work the radio. Thomas called in the full report while she sat there, trying to force her academic mind to process what she'd witnessed. Classification, analysis. There had to be a rational explanation. Mass hallucination brought on by altitude and stress. Misidentification of wildlife behavior. Acoustic anomalies creating false auditory perceptions. But none of those explanations accounted for the fact that both she and Thomas had seen and heard the same things. None of them explained the tool marks on the sealed chamber, or Ethan Cooper's voice recorder, or the gap in the stones that led into darkness. The SAR team arrived from Flagstaff at 2:30 p.m. 12 experienced searchers with technical climbing gear, thermal imaging equipment, and communication systems. Rebecca briefed them using carefully neutral language. Missing person, last known location, evidence of unauthorized entry into restricted area. She didn't mention the sounds, the mimicry, the figures on the canyon walls. Thomas added that they'd encountered potentially aggressive wildlife and recommended teams stay together, maintain constant radio contact, and avoid entering any sealed structures. The search ran until sunset. They found Ethan Cooper at 5:47 p.m. His body was on a ledge approximately 40 feet below the canyon rim, in a section of cliff face that wasn't visible from any maintained trail. The initial report from the climber who found him was clinical. Male subject, early 20s, deceased. Consistent with fall from height, multiple traumatic injuries, no signs of animal scavenging. But when they brought his body up in a litter, Rebecca saw what the initial report hadn't captured. Ethan Cooper's eyes were open, fixed on something only he could see. His mouth was open too, frozen in an expression that Rebecca's mind kept trying to interpret as a smile but wasn't. Not quite. The muscles were pulled wrong, arranged in something that mimicked joy without understanding what joy was. And his hands, clenched into fists, were full of something. The medical examiner would later identify the material as organic tissue, heavily desiccated, wrapped in decomposed textile. Analysis would show it was human skin and wool, approximately 700 years old, consistent with ancestral Puebloan burial practices. Rebecca stood at the edge of the canyon as they loaded Ethan's body into the medical examiner's van. The sun was setting, painting the sandstone in shades of blood and rust. Thomas appeared beside her, his face drawn. "The chamber entrance has been resealed," he said quietly. "We used explosives to collapse the passage, made it look like natural erosion triggered by his disturbance of the site." He paused. "Official report will say he fell while conducting unauthorized research in a restricted area. Accidental death. Happens more often than people think in the national parks." "What about what we saw, what we heard?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the canyon fall into shadow. "There are things the Navajo learned a long time ago. Rules that keep people alive. One of those rules is, you don't disturb the places where the dead were sealed during plague times. You don't open those chambers. The people inside weren't just sick, they were changed by something. The flesh-eating sickness wasn't disease. It was something else, something that got into people and wore them while they were still alive." He looked at her directly. "And the things that guard those boundaries, the Naldlushi, they're not protecting us from the dead. They're protecting the dead from us. keeping them sealed, keeping them from walking again. Rebecca thought about Ethan's smile, about the tissue clutched in his hands, about the way his voice had echoed from the darkness hours after he must have already been dead. The voice recorder, she said. The things he said on the recording. Were those things really him? Does it matter? Thomas replied. He opened the chamber. He touched what was inside. After that, he shrugged. After that, maybe it was still him speaking. Or maybe it was something that learned his voice by tasting his thoughts. The medical examiner's van pulled away, carrying Ethan Cooper's body toward Flagstaff, toward autopsy and official conclusions that would never mention sealed chambers or mimicry, or the things that walked on two legs through ancient canyons. Rebecca watched it go, feeling something settle in her chest. Not quite acceptance, not quite understanding, but a recognition that her doctorate in anthropology had taught her to analyze cultural beliefs while completely missing their function. The Navajo didn't tell stories about Naldlushi to entertain tourists or preserve quaint folklore. They told them because sometimes in certain places, under specific circumstances, the rules of ordinary reality were thin enough that older rules applied. I'm going to request a transfer, she said quietly. Maybe somewhere coastal. Olympic National Park, maybe? Thomas nodded. No one would blame you. This canyon... He trailed off, then finished. This canyon has seen a lot of death over the centuries. Puebloan drought and warfare, Navajo survival during the Long Walk, Kit Carson's Scorched Earth campaign. All that history doesn't just fade, it accumulates. And sometimes it takes forms that remember how to hunt. Rebecca packed her ranger station that night, boxing up her books and maps and carefully neutral official reports. Her academic texts on ancestral Puebloan culture suddenly seemed naive, written by people who'd never stood in the darkness and heard their own voice calling from shadows. She kept the photographs from her camera, documentation she'd never show anyone but couldn't bring herself to delete. Evidence that some folklore wasn't metaphor. She left Canyon de Chelly 3 days later, on October 15, 2008, driving north toward Utah with her belongings in the back of her Ford Ranger. In her rearview mirror, the canyon dropped away into rust-colored shadow, ancient and patient. The transfer to Olympic would be approved. She'd spend the next 6 years studying temperate rainforest ecology, deliberately choosing environments as different from high desert canyons as possible. She'd publish papers on Roosevelt elk population dynamics and spotted owl habitat preservation, safe topics, measurable variables, questions that had answers. But sometimes, late at night in her ranger cabin in Washington, she'd hear something moving in the old-growth forest. Footsteps with the wrong rhythm. Voices that sounded almost human calling from the tree line. And she'd remember Thomas Begay's words. They're not protecting us from the dead. They're protecting the dead from us. The official Park Service report on Ethan Cooper's death was filed as case the 2008 CD 247. Accidental fall, unauthorized area access. The report noted that the subject had violated multiple park regulations by entering restricted archaeological sites without permits, likely resulting in disorientation and a fatal fall during darkness. The report recommended enhanced signage and increased patrols in sensitive areas. It made no mention of sealed chambers, mimicry, or the things that guarded boundaries between the living and the dead. The chamber entrance remained collapsed. The Navajo staff at Canyon de Chelly continued to avoid certain sections of the canyon, especially after dark. And sometimes, hikers reported hearing voices calling for help from areas where no one could possibly be. Voices that sounded exactly like missing persons from previous searches, saying exactly what rescue teams would want to hear. The Park Service called it acoustic phenomena and recommended hikers maintain situational awareness at all times. Those who knew better called it by older names and remembered why some stories survived centuries. Not because they entertained, but because they warned. Because some boundaries existed for reasons that predated scientific understanding. Because the world was older and stranger than academic texts acknowledged, and in certain places, under specific circumstances, you could still encounter the things that older peoples had learned to name, to fear, and to avoid. Rebecca Miller never returned to Canyon de Chelly. But she never forgot what she learned there either. That sometimes folklore preserved truth better than science, that some doors should remain sealed, and that the worst horror wasn't the things that hunted in darkness. It was realizing how much darkness existed in places you'd been taught to see as comprehensible, mapped, and safe. The monsters weren't metaphors. They were simply patient, waiting in sealed chambers and shadowed canyons, wearing the voices of the dead like masks, smiling with too many teeth at anyone foolish enough to disturb what ancient peoples had wisely chosen to seal away forever. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The morning Ashley Chen disappeared, Derek Holloway was recalibrating the weather station at Ho Lake, his gloved fingers methodically checking each sensor against the diagnostic readout on his Panasonic Toughbook. October in the Ho rainforest meant fog dense enough to taste, a metallic dampness that clung to everything and reduced visibility to the moss-draped Sitka spruces immediately surrounding the trail. Derek preferred it this way. 34 years old, he'd spent the last 9 years with Olympic National Park Service, precisely because the data here was cleaner, the variables more controllable than the chaos of his previous posting in Yellowstone. Numbers didn't lie. Atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, precipitation levels. These were certainties in a world that too often trafficked in assumptions. His radio crackled at 10:47 a.m. "Derek, this is base. We've got a situation." He recognized Marissa Chen's voice, the dispatch coordinator who'd worked Olympic longer than anyone else. 58 years old, Marissa didn't use the word situation lightly. "Go ahead, base." Missing hiker reported on the Ho River Trail. 24-year-old female solo hiker, last confirmed sighting yesterday at 3:15 p.m. near the ranger station. Name's Ashley Chen. A pause. "My niece." Derek's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. He'd met Ashley twice, once at the 4th of July barbecue Marissa hosted, once when she'd stopped by the station to get trail recommendations. Environmental science grad student from UW. Smart, cautious, the kind who'd file proper trip plans. "I'm 40 minutes from the trailhead," Derek said, already packing his equipment. "You've initiated standard protocol?" "SAR teams assembling. But Derek..." Marissa's voice carried an uncharacteristic tremor. "Her car's still at the lot. Phone's going straight to voicemail and you should see the tent." "The tent?" "She made camp at mile marker 6. Everything's there. Food's hanging properly, gear organized, sleeping bag laid out. But the tent's inside out." Derek frowned as he secured his pack. Inside out. Like someone grabbed it from the inside and inverted the whole structure without unzipping it. Tom's been ranging for 20 years. He's never seen anything like it. Derek began the descent toward the Ho River Trail, his mind automatically cataloging logical explanations. Bare activity could account for tent displacement, though the inside-out configuration suggested something more deliberate. Wind shear was possible, though the forest canopy here typically prevented that level of disruption. Vandalism seemed unlikely given the remoteness. He reached Ashley's campsite at 11:52 a.m. Tom Whitaker, the senior ranger who'd found it, stood near the tent with his arms crossed, breath visible in air that should have been at least 50 degrees, but felt closer to 30. "Holloway," Tom said, "tell me what you see." Derek approached methodically, photographing the scene from multiple angles with his Nikon D90. The tent was indeed inverted, the interior surface now facing outward, the stakes still secured at their original positions. The sleeping bag lay undisturbed inside, along with Ashley's backpack and a field journal open to a page dated October 18th, 2009. Yesterday. He read her final entry. 3:00 p.m. Temperature dropped 15 degrees in the last hour. Can't explain it. Fog's getting thicker. Keep hearing something that sounds like wind chimes, but there's no wind. Planning to pack out first thing tomorrow. Derek took out his digital thermometer. 31 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked the weather station data on his Toughbook, pulling up the historical log for this specific GPS coordinate. According to the sensors positioned every half mile along this section of trail, the temperature here should be 54 degrees. But his thermometer, freshly calibrated that morning, insisted otherwise. "You seeing this?" Tom asked, nodding toward the fog. The mist moved wrong. Derek had spent nearly a decade observing fog patterns, understanding how atmospheric moisture behaved in temperate rainforests. Fog should drift uniformly, responding to minor air currents. This fog coiled. It formed discrete tendrils that seemed to reach and withdraw, creating negative spaces that exposed and then concealed the enormous spruce trunks. "Thermal inversion layer," Derek said automatically, though he'd never seen one create this specific effect. "We should expand the search radius." By 2:30 p.m., the SAR team had deployed along the Hoh River Trail in both directions from Ashley's campsite. Derek took the northern route, following the river toward Elk Lake, his GPS tracking his position as he called Ashley's name at 100-foot intervals. The forest absorbed his voice. Normally, in this terrain, you'd hear at least some echo, some reflection of sound off the dense vegetation. Here, his words disappeared into an acoustic void that felt deliberately muffling. At mile marker 6.3, Derek found the first anomaly. Ashley's hiking boots, still laced, positioned neatly in the center of the trail. The boots pointed east, away from the campsite, but there were no tracks leading away from them. The trail's mud should have captured something. Bare footprints, drag marks, any indication of how she'd left the boots behind. The earth showed nothing, as if she'd simply evaporated upward. Derek documented everything with his camera, then radioed the discovery to base. While waiting for the evidence collection team, he noticed something in his peripheral vision. When he turned to look directly, it vanished. But when he gazed at the surrounding forest, he could see it in the corner of his eye. A pale shape standing motionless approximately 40 feet into the tree line. He counted to 10, maintaining his peripheral focus. The shape remained stationary. Derek pulled out his flashlight despite the afternoon light, shining it toward the figure. The beam penetrated the fog, illuminating only trees and moss. But the moment he switched off the light, his peripheral vision registered the shape again, slightly closer. "Ashley?" he called out. His voice disappeared into that impossible silence. The shape moved, not walked, moved. It relocated from one position to another without traversing the space between, appearing 8 feet to the left of its original position in the span of Derek's blink. Derek's heart rate increased. He noted the physiological response clinically: elevated pulse, shallow breathing. The evolutionary fight-or-flight response triggered by his amygdala, interpreting this aberrant pattern as a threat. But threats had explanations. Light refraction through fog could create pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive patterns, particularly faces and figures, in random stimuli. Except the shape moved again. Closer. Derek stepped backward onto the trail, maintaining visual contact through his peripheral vision, while his direct gaze focused on his GPS unit. The device flickered. The coordinate reading stuttered between accurate numbers and impossible values that would place him simultaneously in Olympic National Park and in the Pacific Ocean 40 miles west. "Base, this is Holloway," he said into his radio. Static answered him. He checked the frequency, correct. He checked the battery, full. But the static continued, and beneath it, barely audible, something that might have been breathing or might have been wind, or might have been someone whispering in a language Derek didn't recognize. The evidence team arrived 35 minutes later. By then, Derek had moved back to Ashley's boots and the shape had disappeared completely. He mentioned nothing about it in his report, because reports required evidence, and peripheral hallucinations didn't qualify. That evening, back at the ranger station, Derek pulled the historical records for Olympic National Park disappearances. The database was comprehensive, digitized from paper archives going back to the park's establishment in 1938. He entered his search parameters: missing hikers, unsolved cases, Hoh River Trail vicinity. The results materialized on his screen at 7:43 p.m. October 19, 1999. Rebecca Hayashi, 23 years old, solo hiker. Last seen near mile marker 6 on the Ho River Trail. Tent found intact but empty. Personal belongings undisturbed. No trace of Rebecca ever located. October 18, 1989, Jennifer Nakamura, 25 years old, disappeared from the same approximate location. Boots found on trail, no footprints leading away. October 19, 1979, Sarah Tanaka, 22 years old. Campsite discovered abandoned sleeping bag still warm. Extensive search yielded no results. Derek expanded his search parameters, going further back into the paper archives. The old records required manual review, faded typewritten reports stored in the basement filing system. He descended into the storage room at 9:15 p.m., fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as he pulled boxes labeled by decade. In a water-stained folder from the 1920s, he found it. Not a missing person report, something else. A documentation of a labor camp that had existed 3 miles from the current Ho River Trail, established in 1923 to support logging operations before the area became protected parkland. The camp housed 47 Japanese laborers, primarily immigrants from Fukushima Prefecture. The camp's medical log, written in stilted English by a company doctor named Whitmore, detailed an incident in October 1924. A young woman named Sayuri Matsumoto, 22 years old, had been found dead in the forest. The cause of death? Homicide. The circumstances? According to witness statements, she'd been accused of bringing bad luck to the camp after 3 workers died in separate accidents. On October 18, 1924, several men had dragged her into the forest during the night. Dr. Whitmore's report ended with a single line. The laborers claim she cursed them as she died. They fear retribution. This fear has made them dangerous. The official record stopped there, but clipped to the medical log was a personal letter, never sent, dated October 25, 1924. Dr. Whitmore's handwriting had deteriorated from the clinical precision of his reports. I cannot explain what I have seen. The men who killed Matsumoto have begun disappearing, always during the new moon, always leaving their belongings untouched, as if they simply ceased to exist mid-step. Those who remain speak of a woman in white appearing in the fog, her hair longer than possible, her hands reaching. They have attempted Buddhist rituals, but none among them are priests. Tonight I heard singing from the forest, a woman's voice performing what I recognize as a traditional funeral lament, though there is no woman here to sing it. I am leaving tomorrow. This place is not right. Derek's hands were shaking as he photographed the documents. He checked the date. October 18th, 2009. The lunar calendar on his phone showed tonight as the new moon. He climbed the stairs from the basement at 10:37 p.m. The ranger station's main floor was empty, illuminated only by emergency lighting, and the glow of his laptop screen still displaying the missing persons database. Derek approached his workstation to shut it down, then stopped. A new document had opened on his screen. He hadn't opened it. The file name read, Sayuri. Texty Derek's cursor wasn't touching the trackpad, but it moved independently across the screen. It selected all text in the document and pressed delete, leaving a blank page. Then words appeared, typed by no physical hands. Kairu, 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 Kairu. Derek recognized the word from his undergraduate Japanese language course, taken years ago to fulfill a foreign language requirement. Kairu, to return, to come home. The text continued, Jugatsu, Juhachi Nichi, October 18th. The temperature in the station plummeted. Derek's breath materialized in the air. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then steadied to a dimmer luminescence that cast everything in a sickly pallor. His thermometer, lying on the desk, read 23 degrees. In the window's reflection, Derek saw her. She stood behind him, but when he spun around, the station was empty. When he looked back at the window, she remained in the reflection, a woman in a white burial kimono, her black hair hanging past her waist, obscuring her face. Her hands, visible at her sides, possessed fingers that were too long, joints that bent at angles that human anatomy shouldn't permit. Derek backed away from the window, His rational mind supplied explanations: fatigue-induced hallucination, optical illusion created by external lights refracting through the glass, pareidolia again, his visual cortex constructing meaning from random patterns. But the reflection moved. It stepped closer to where Derek had been standing, and the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. The radio on Derek's desk activated without anyone touching it. Through the static came that sound again, clearer now. Breathing interspersed with whispered words in Japanese. Derek's limited vocabulary caught fragments. Kaeta, I returned. Urameshia, I'm bitter, I resent. Mukui, retribution. Then, in perfect English, a woman's voice said, She looks like me. The lights went out completely. Derek's flashlight was in his hand before conscious thought could register, the beam cutting through absolute darkness. The station's backup generator should have activated within 30 seconds of power failure. Derek counted the seconds. 31, 32, 45. No generator. He swept the flashlight across the station. Everything appeared normal. Desks, filing cabinets, topographic maps on the walls. But the temperature continued to fall and the fog outside had pressed against the windows, creating a white opacity that blocked any view of the parking lot where Derek's truck was parked. Movement in the flashlight beam. Derek snapped toward it, illuminating the doorway to the basement. The door stood open. He'd closed it after returning from the archives. He was certain he'd closed it. The breathing sound was coming from the basement now, along with something else. The distinct sound of footsteps ascending the stairs. Not walking up, ascending with wrong intervals between steps, sometimes 2 steps in rapid succession, then a pause too long, then 3 steps. The rhythm was off, like someone learning to climb stairs for the first time, or someone who no longer quite remembered how human locomotion worked. Derek moved toward the station's main exit. His hand found the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. The door wasn't locked. The knob rotated freely, but the door itself remained sealed as if the frame had been welded shut. He put his shoulder into it. The door didn't budge. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. Derek turned, flashlight aimed at the doorway. For several seconds, nothing appeared. Then the fog from outside began flowing into the station, pouring through windows that were closed, seeping through walls that should have been solid. The fog carried that smell, not decomposition exactly, but something older, like earth that had been frozen for decades suddenly thawing. In the doorway, outlined by Derek's flashlight, she stood. Her white kimono was clean, pristine, but her hair moved independently of any air current, writhing slowly like kelp in ocean tide. Her face remained hidden behind the black curtain of her hair, except for her hands. Those 2 long fingers stretched toward Derek, and where they pointed, the fog coiled and reached. Derek's back pressed against the unyielding door. His mind scrambled for explanation, for some rational framework that could contain what his eyes reported. Mass hallucination induced by carbon monoxide? Impossible. CO detectors would have triggered. Shared delusion? He was alone. Neurological event? Perhaps a stroke causing vivid confabulation? But his motor control was fine, his speech clear when he heard himself say, "You're not real." The figure's head tilted. The movement was too fluid, possessing too many degrees of freedom, like her neck contained additional vertebrae. Behind the veil of hair, something that might have been a mouth opened, and the temperature plunged to single digits. She spoke in layered voices, multiple women speaking simultaneously in that whispering tone. Watashi wa totemo genjitsu teki desu. I am very real. Derek's Garmin GPS unit, clipped to his belt, began beeping. He glanced down at the screen. The device was tracking movement, his movement, but the map showed him in 2 locations simultaneously. One position indicator placed him inside the ranger station. The other placed him at mile marker 6.3 on the Ho River Trail, the exact spot where he'd found Ashley's boots. When he looked up, the woman in white had moved. She now stood 3 feet away, though Derek had not seen her cross the intervening distance. This close, he could see through the gaps in her hair. Where her eyes should have been, there was only shadow. Not empty sockets, but shadow that moved and pooled like liquid, occasionally forming suggestions of iris and pupil before dissolving again. Anata no kashoku no kami, she whispered. Your brown hair. Her hand reached toward Derek's face. Those fingers elongated as they approached, stretching impossibly, and where they came close to his skin, Derek felt the heat drain from his body. Not cold, the absence of heat, the void where thermal energy simply ceased to exist. Derek did what his training had never prepared him for. He closed his eyes and recited data. October 18, 2009, 10:51 p.m., Olympic National Park headquarters, ambient temperature 14 degrees Fahrenheit, experiencing unexplained phenomena that may be linked to historical events from October 1924, involving the death of Sayuri Matsumoto, Japanese laborer, age 22, murdered by... The cold fingers touched his cheek. The contact felt like frostbite and burning simultaneously, a sensation his nervous system had no framework to interpret. Derek's eyes snapped open involuntarily. She pulled her hand back and clutched in those two long fingers with something that looked like fog, but held the shape of Derek's face. A translucent mask of his own features, still bearing the expression of terror he'd been wearing. The woman tilted her head the other direction, studying the mask. Then she released it, and the fog face dissipated into the surrounding mist. Chigao, she said. Wrong. The lights flickered back on. The fog retreated, flowing back through solid walls as impossibly as it had entered. The temperature rose. Derek's thermometer showed 51 degrees. The basement door stood closed. His GPS showed a single position indicator at the ranger station. The woman in white was gone. Derek's legs gave out. He sat on the floor back against the unyielding door that now, when he reached up to test the knob, opened easily. His hands shook as he pulled out his field journal and documented everything, every detail, with the precision of someone who knew that without documentation, experience became subjective, unreliable, dismissible. At 11:07 p.m., his phone rang. Marissa's voice. Derek, SAR found something. You need to come to the staging area. He drove to the trailhead with hands that still trembled on the steering wheel. The SAR staging area was ablaze with portable lights, casting harsh shadows across the assembled rangers and volunteers. Tom Whitaker stood near a folding table, his face ashen. We found evidence marker flags, Tom said, but we didn't place them. They're old-style flags, the type we stopped using in the 70s. Someone put them out there recently, creating a trail. We followed them. Where? Derek asked. To the old labor camp location. 3 miles off trail. The flags led straight to it. Derek felt ice reform in his veins. What's there? See for yourself, Tom said, handing Derek a digital camera. Photos from a half hour ago. Derek clicked through the images. The first few showed the trail of flags, the old-style orange markers staked at regular intervals through dense undergrowth. Then the images showed a clearing, the remains of the 1920s labor camp, barely recognizable, mostly reclaimed by forest. But in the center of the clearing stood a structure that shouldn't have survived nearly 90 years of Pacific Northwest weather, a small altar made from rotting wood, topped with items that appeared recently placed. Derek zoomed in on the altar's contents, a white kimono folded precisely, a black comb, and 5 photographs. Not old photographs, but recent prints, their colors vibrant. Derek recognized 4 of the faces from the missing persons reports. Rebecca Hayashi, 1999. Jennifer Nakamura, 1989. Sarah Tanaka, 1979. And a 4th woman Derek hadn't found in the records, a black and white photo that looked like it came from the 1960s. The 5th photograph showed Ashley Chen, taken from her UW student ID, though that photo should have been in Ashley's wallet, which was in her backpack at the campsite. There's more, Tom said. Behind the altar, you need to see it in person. Derek hiked to the site with Tom and 2 other rangers, arriving at 1:23 a.m. The clearing was exactly as the photos showed it, illuminated now by their headlamps. The altar stood undisturbed, the photographs arranged with ceremonial precision. Behind the altar, carved into a massive Sitka spruce, were names. Fresh carvings. The wood still pale where the bark had been stripped away. Sayuri Matsumoto, 1924. Keiko Yamada, 1964. Sarah Tanaka, 1979. Jennifer Nakamura, 1989. Rebecca Hayashi, 1999. Ashley Chen, 2009. That tree's at least 400 years old, Tom said. These carvings were made within the last 24 hours. The sap's still running. Who the hell did this, and how did they know about the historical names? Derek approached the tree, running his flashlight over the carvings. The lettering was precise, uniform, created with what looked like a carving knife or chisel. But there were no footprints around the tree base. The moss here was undisturbed, delicate ferns still standing upright, as if no one had physically approached the trunk. Tom, Derek said, in Japanese folklore, what happens to people who die violent deaths with unresolved hatred? How the hell would I know? They become onryo, vengeful spirits. They can't move on until they achieve vengeance, until the scales balance. Derek pointed at the carved names. Sayuri Matsumoto was murdered by the labor camp workers. According to the records, those workers started disappearing. But this isn't complete. Look at the dates. Every 40 years, starting after a 40-year gap from 1924. But then the pattern changed. 1989, only 10 years after 1979, and 1999, another decade. Then, 2009. The intervals are decreasing, Derek said. She's getting stronger, or the barrier between worlds is getting thinner. Every October 18th during the new moon she returns, and she takes someone who looks like her, young women with East Asian features and dark hair. That's... Tom started, then stopped. That's insane. Look at the evidence, Derek said, his voice steadying as he retreated into analysis. Women disappearing from the same location, at predictable intervals tied to lunar cycles. No physical evidence of abduction. Unexplained environmental anomalies, temperature drops, electromagnetic interference. Historical precedent for violent death and subsequent supernatural belief. This follows a pattern. Patterns have explanations, Tom said. This pattern has one, Derek replied. You just don't want to accept it. A sound cut through the forest, a woman's scream, distant but clear, coming from deeper in the woods beyond the clearing. All 4 rangers turned toward it, flashlights sweeping the tree line. Ashley? Tom shouted. The scream came again, closer. Not quite right. The pitch was human, but the duration was too long. A single sustained note that should have required 3 times normal lung capacity. And beneath it, Derek heard something else. That same whispered breathing he'd encountered at the station. We need to move back to the trail, Derek said. Now. But Tom was already running toward the sound, 2 other rangers following. Derek stood alone in the clearing, watching their lights disappear into the forest. He looked back at the altar, at Ashley's photograph placed among the others. The photograph was gone. Derek spun, scanning the clearing. His flashlight beam caught movement at the clearing's edge, a flash of white among the dark trees. Then another from a different direction. Then a third behind him. The woman in white, appearing and disappearing at multiple positions simultaneously, or perhaps there were multiple women, multiple spirits converging. Derek ran. He crashed through the underbrush, following the flags back toward the main trail, his GPS clutched in one hand, flashlight in the other. The GPS screen flickered between accuracy and impossibility, the position indicator jumping randomly across the map. Behind him, he heard that sustained scream again, coming from every direction at once. He burst onto the Ho River Trail at mile marker 6.3, exactly where he'd found Ashley's boots. The boots were gone now, the trail empty, his radio producing only static when he tried to call for backup. Derek forced himself to stop, to breathe, to think. The scientific method still applied, even in chaos, even when confronting phenomena that seemed to violate natural law. Observation and hypothesis had value. Hypothesis. Sayuri Matsumoto's violent death created a psychic echo, a repetitive haunting tied to specific temporal and spatial coordinates. The pattern suggested she was collecting victims who symbolically represented herself, creating a congregation of wronged women. Hypothesis. This was elaborate theater. A serial killer using historical research and psychological manipulation to create the appearance of supernatural activity while committing very human crimes. Derek's GPS unit beeped. He looked at the screen. A new waypoint had appeared, marked automatically by the device, though Derek hadn't created it. The coordinates placed it approximately 200 yards off trail, bearing 047 degrees northeast. The waypoint's label read, Ashley. Derek stood at a decision point. Protocol demanded he return to the staging area, report the situation, wait for daylight and proper resources. But if Ashley was alive, every minute mattered. And if this was all an elaborate deception, then someone very dangerous was in these woods, manipulating technology and exploiting historical tragedy. He marked his current position and followed the bearing toward the waypoint. The forest grew denser here, the enormous spruces blocking even starlight, his flashlight creating a narrow tunnel of visibility. The temperature dropped with each step until his breath came in dense clouds. At 45 yards from the waypoint, Derek found the second altar. Smaller than the first, constructed from river stones stacked in a precise cairn. Placed atop the stones, Ashley's hiking boots, her phone, her car keys, and something else. A white mask carved from wood in the style of traditional Japanese no theater. The mask depicted a young woman's face, beautiful and expressionless. Derek photographed everything, his documentation instinct overriding his fear. As he zoomed in on the mask, he noticed something. The carved features resembled the faces from the altar photographs. Sayuri's face, perhaps, or a generalized representation of her victims. The mask's eyes were hollow, and through those hollow spaces Derek saw light. Not his flashlight's reflection, a pale greenish luminescence like foxfire, emanating from within the mask itself. He reached toward it, then stopped. Every folklore tradition that dealt with vengeful spirits emphasized the same principle. Don't take what belongs to them. Don't disturb their offerings. Derek withdrew his hand. As he did, the mask's wooden surface changed. The expression shifted. Still wooden, still carved, but now the mouth curved into a smile. A smile too wide, stretching the carved features beyond what the original artisan could have created. Behind Derek, a voice whispered, "Mitsukeda. Found you." He turned. She stood 5 feet away, fully visible now, no longer a peripheral shadow or window reflection. Her white kimono moved in a wind that didn't exist, her black hair writhing, and when she raised her 2 long fingers toward Derek's face, he could see that her hands dripped with something dark that might have been water, but smelled like copper and earth. Derek did not run. He'd already understood he couldn't outrun her. Instead, he asked, "Where's Ashley?" The woman's head tilted. Behind her veil of hair, those shadow eyes swirled and occasionally coalesced into something almost human. She raised one hand and pointed deeper into the forest, toward the waypoint's exact location. Then she spoke, not in whispered Japanese but in clear English, with an accent that suggested someone who'd learned the language a century ago. "They took my name, took my face, said I brought death." She drifted closer, not walking but translating through space. "They dragged me here, held me down. I looked at stars while they hurt me. October sky, hunter's moon becoming new." "A Sayuri Matsumoto," Derek said. The woman stopped moving. For a moment the writhing hair settled, and through the gaps Derek glimpsed a young face, human and ordinary, and filled with measureless sorrow. "They left me," she continued. "No funeral, no prayers. Spirit cannot rest without proper rites, so I wait, return, take back what was stolen, take faces like mine, keep them with me." She pointed again toward the waypoint. "This one ran far, fought hard, but spirit weight is heavy. She sleeps now." "Is she alive?" Derek asked. "For now. Until moon completes cycle, then she joins." Derek calculated rapidly. The new moon had begun tonight, October 18th. The lunar phase would last approximately 2 days before beginning to wax. If Sayuri's pattern followed traditional Onryo mythology, the victim had to die during the new moon to complete the binding. What if I bring you proper funeral rites? Derek asked. Buddhist ceremony? Proper burial? Release your spirit from this cycle. Sayuri's face disappeared behind her hair again. The temperature plunged another 10 degrees. When she spoke, her voice multiplied, becoming the layered chorus of 6 women. Words, empty words. No one prays for forgotten dead. No one speaks names of murdered women. I'll speak your name, Derek said. I'll document what happened. I'll ensure you're remembered properly. The chorus of voices laughed, and the sound was worse than screaming. Documents, papers. You people love papers. Fill papers with truth, then file them away. Hide them. Forget. She was right, Derek realized. He'd found the documentation of her death buried in water-stained archives that no one had opened in decades. Truth without witnesses was just ink on degrading paper. Then tell me what you need, Derek said. There has to be a way to end this. Sayuri drifted closer until her face was inches from Derek's, until he could see through her hair to the void where her eyes should have been. Vengeance, she whispered. All who killed me, punished. But they died long ago. Natural deaths. Easy deaths. No justice. No balance. Then the cycle never ends, Derek said. You keep taking innocent women who had nothing to do with what happened to you. They have my face, my dark hair, my youth stolen. They give back what was taken. The multiple voices softened to a single tone. You understand numbers, measure man. I watch you count, measure, document. You think numbers explain everything. They explain patterns, Derek said. Then explain this pattern. I died 1924. 40 years, earth absorbs blood. Spirit gains strength. 1964, I wake. Take first one. Feel her terror. Feel alive again for moments. But not enough. Never enough. Wait. 1979, take second. Easier this time. Veil thinner. 1989, only 10 years. Veil tears more. 1999, even easier. This year, she gestured around at the fog, the impossible cold, her own solid form. This year, I am almost real. Next cycle, I will not need to wait. I will stay. Walk these trees. Take anyone, everyone, all who enter my forest. Derek's mind raced through the implications. If the pattern held, the next occurrence wouldn't be 2019, it would be sooner. Maybe 2014, then 2016, then 2017, 2018, continuous. An accelerating haunting that would make this entire section of Olympic National Park essentially uninhabitable, unless someone broke the cycle. The men who killed you had families, Derek said. Descendants. Living people who carry their bloodline. Sayuri's form flickered, becoming translucent, then solidifying again. Yes, she hissed. They're children, children's children, living comfortable lives, speaking English, forgetting Japanese, forgetting what their grandfathers did. That's who you want, Derek said, understanding. But you can't find them, can you? You're bound to this location, to the coordinates where you died. You can only take who comes to you. Show me, Sayuri said, her voice becoming a command that bypassed Derek's conscious will and spoke directly to some older part of his brain. Show me their names, where they live. I will find them. I will take what is owed. Derek's hands moved involuntarily toward his laptop bag. He could research the labor camp workers' descendants. With enough time and access to genealogical records, he could potentially identify living relatives. He could hand over innocent people to a vengeful ghost. His hands stopped moving. No, he said. The temperature dropped so rapidly that Derek's breath froze mid-exhalation, ice crystals forming in the air. Sayuri's form expanded, her white kimono spreading like wings, her hair multiplying into 1,000 writhing strands that reached toward Derek from every direction. You refuse. Me? The layered voices returned, furious, loud enough to make Derek's ears ring. I refuse to condemn innocent people for their ancestors' crimes, Derek said, his voice steady despite the supernatural maelstrom surrounding him. That's not justice. That's just more vengeance, more death, the cycle continuing. Sayuri's hair wrapped around Derek's wrists, his neck, his chest. The strands felt solid but wrong, like touching ice that burned instead of froze. She pulled him closer until he was drowning in the black curtain of her hair, until he couldn't see anything but void. "Then you take their place," she whispered. "You carry their guilt. You die instead." Derek felt the hair tighten, constricting his airways, his circulation. His vision began to darken at the edges, but through the gathering unconsciousness a thought crystallized. This is how she killed them. The workers who murdered her. She haunted them until they walked into the forest and never returned. She took them the same way she's taking me now, and that meant they deserved it. But Ashley didn't. The other women didn't. They were just victims of geography and phenotype, wrong place and wrong face. With the last of his air, Derek managed to speak. "Dozo, yurusete, kudasai." "Please forgive me." The constriction stopped. The hair loosened but didn't release. Sayuri's face emerged from the void, fully human now. Tear tracks visible on her cheeks, though ghosts shouldn't be able to cry. "You speak my language," she whispered. "Poorly," Derek gasped. "I studied 2 semesters, undergraduate. Barely passed. You speak my language." She released him completely, and Derek collapsed to the ground, gasping. 85 years. No one has spoken my language to me. Not one word. Not even the women with my face. They are Americans. Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei. They do not speak Japanese. Do not know traditions. Cannot even apologize properly. Derek pulled himself to his knees, his throat bruised but functional. "Matsumoto Sayuri-san," he began, using the formal construction. "Anata no kurushimi wa tadashiku kiroku saremasu. Anata no namae wa oboete imasu." Your suffering will be properly recorded. Your name will be remembered. Sayuri knelt in front of him, her movements suddenly graceful, human, the monstrous qualities receding. "You cannot give me vengeance," she said. "You cannot give me life. What can you give?" "Truth," Derek said. "Documentation that isn't hidden. A memorial. Your name carved in stone at the trailhead. The story of what happened to you told to every hiker who enters these woods. You won't be forgotten again." "Words," Sayuri said, but without the earlier bitterness. "Words have power," Derek said. "Names have power. You know that. It's why you kept taking women. You were trying to become whole again, but you can't do that by consuming others. You can only become whole by being properly mourned." Sayuri's form flickered, fading to translucence. "The sun will rise in 4 hours. The new moon ends in 2 days. If you do not fulfill promise, I take the girl with my face. I take you. I take everyone who enters my forest. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Then go." Sayuri pointed toward the waypoint coordinates. "She is there, sleeping. When she wakes, she will remember nothing. The mind cannot hold spirit weight without breaking, but she lives, for now." Derek stood on shaking legs. "Matsumoto-san, will you let her go? After the memorial?" Sayuri smiled, and it was the saddest expression Derek had ever seen. "I will try," she said, "but anger is heavy. Heavier than body, heavier than years. Some weights cannot be put down easily." She faded completely then, disappearing into the fog. The temperature rose. The forest sounds returned, owls hooting, small animals moving through underbrush, the distant rush of the Ho River. Derek's GPS showed normal readings. His radio crackled with voices from the SAR team searching the trails. He walked the remaining distance to the waypoint, and there, in a small depression between enormous spruce roots, he found Ashley Chen. She lay on her side, breathing slowly, her eyes moving beneath closed lids in REM sleep. No injuries. No signs of hypothermia despite the impossible cold Derek had experienced. He radioed her position to SAR, then sat down nearby to wait, his field journal open, his pen moving rapidly across the page. He documented everything, not in the clinical language of official reports, but in plain English that anyone could understand. The truth of Sayuri Matsumoto. The truth of her murder. The truth of what had happened to the women who disappeared. When the SAR team arrived 45 minutes later, Ashley was beginning to wake, confused, but unharmed. Tom Whitaker found Derek still writing, the field journal now containing 12 pages of dense handwriting. "We need to get you both checked out," Tom said. "I need to make some calls first," Derek replied. "We're going to need a Buddhist priest, and a stonemason, and permission to place a memorial at the trailhead. I'll need to speak with the park superintendent directly." "Derek, you're not making sense. You need medical attention." "No," Derek said, standing up and tucking the journal into his jacket. "I'm making perfect sense for the first time tonight. I'll explain everything. But first I need you to tell me, do you know any descendants of Japanese laborers who worked in Olympic National Forest in the 1920s? Tom stared at him. "Why?" "Because we're going to find them. We're going to bring them here, and we're going to make them understand what their grandfathers did. Not for revenge, for witness, for closure, for ending a cycle that's been running for 85 years. Derek looked back toward the clearing where Sayuri's altar stood, though he couldn't see it from this distance. The fog was dissipating as sunrise approached, revealing the massive spruce trees that had stood sentinel over human tragedy for nearly a century. He thought he saw just for a moment a flash of white among the trees, a woman's silhouette watching, waiting to see if this stranger who spoke broken Japanese would keep his promise. Derek Holloway spent the next 3 weeks fighting bureaucracy with the same methodical precision he applied to data analysis. He filed reports, gave testimony, contacted historical societies, tracked down genealogical records, found 3 living descendants of the 1924 labor camp workers, 2 in Seattle, 1 in Portland. He contacted them, explained the history their families had never discussed, invited them to a ceremony. On November 7, 2009, 18 days after Ashley Chen's rescue, a small group gathered at the Ho River Trail's trailhead. A Buddhist priest from Tacoma performed a proper funeral rite, chanting sutras that echoed through the forest. The descendants of the men who'd killed Sayuri Matsumoto stood silent, their faces reflecting shock and shame and acceptance. A memorial plaque was unveiled, black granite carved with English and Japanese. In memory of Sayuri Matsumoto, 1902-1924, who died violently in these woods. May her spirit find peace. May her name be remembered. May all who enter here know that these forests hold stories of both beauty and sorrow. Derek spoke last, reading from his field journal the account of what happened to Sayuri, how she'd been accused and murdered, how injustice had chained her to this place. He spoke her name 17 times during his testimony, once for each year she'd lived, wanting to fill the forest with the sound of her being remembered. When the ceremony ended and the small crowd dispersed, Derek walked alone to mile marker 6-3. He stood there as darkness fell, as fog began to creep between the trees, as the temperature dropped toward freezing. He waited. He didn't know if she would come, if the ceremony had been enough, if spirits could truly be laid to rest with apologies and stone memorials. At 8:47 p.m. he felt her presence, not the oppressive cold and terror of before, but something gentler, a whisper of movement in his peripheral vision. When he turned his head, he saw her standing at the tree line, still wearing her white kimono, her hair still long and black but no longer writhing. She looked human, young, tired. "Arigato gozaimasu," she said. "Thank you." "Did it help?" Derek asked. "Sukoshi. A little. The weight is lighter, the anger is quieter, but..." She gestured around at the forest. "I am still here, still bound. Some chains are too old to break with words. Will you let people pass safely? Hikers? Campers?" Sayuri was quiet for a long moment. "I will try," she finally said. "The ones with my face, I will try to let them pass. But on October 18th, when the moon is new, I cannot promise. The anger returns. The weight becomes heavy. I forget why I should show mercy. Then I'll come back," Derek said. "Every October 18th. I'll come here and speak to you. Remind you of your name. Tell you that you're remembered. Will that help? Maybe. She smiled, and it transformed her face from something terrifying to something heartbreakingly human. You are strange man, Measure Man. You count everything. Document everything. But you believe in ghosts. I believe in patterns, Derek said. And evidence. And you're both. Sayuri laughed, a sound like wind chimes, beautiful and sad. I should hate you, she said. You are man, American. You have everything I was denied. But you speak my language. You remember my name, you tried to help. So instead of hate, I give you this. Warning. She drifted closer, near enough that Derek could see the places where she was translucent, where the forest showed through her form. There are others, she whispered. Other forgotten, other angry, other bound to trees and rivers and mountains. This forest is old, older than America, older than Japan. It remembers everything. Everyone who died here, everyone who was wronged. Most sleep, but some wake, and they are not as patient as me. Are you warning me away? Derek asked. No. I am warning you to listen, to pay attention, to believe what your instruments cannot measure. She reached out as if to touch his face, but stopped before making contact. You will see more impossible things, Measure Man. When you do, remember, just because your tools cannot count something does not mean it is not real. She faded then, dissolving into the fog, her final words hanging in the air. Sayonara, Derek-san, until October. Derek stood alone in the darkness, feeling the forest's weight around him. Thousands of acres of ancient trees, centuries of human history, countless stories buried beneath moss and fern. His thermometer read 48 degrees. His GPS showed his exact position. His radio connected him to the ranger station 2 miles away, but he could still feel her presence, faint now but not entirely gone. And he knew that come next October, when the moon went dark and the temperature dropped and the fog began to move with wrong patterns, he would return to this spot. He would speak her name. He would remind her of the memorial, the ceremony, the promise that she was remembered. Because patterns mattered. Documentation mattered. Truth mattered. Even when the truth was impossible to measure, Derek returned to his truck and drove back toward the ranger station. His field journal containing 17 pages of documentation that would never make it into official reports, but that he would keep, preserve, and eventually pass on to whoever came after him. Evidence for future analysts who might encounter similar phenomena and need to know that they weren't the first, that the impossible had been documented before. As he drove, his headlights caught a flash of white at the road's edge, a woman in a kimono watching him pass. Derek raised his hand in acknowledgement. Sayuri raised hers in return. Then she was gone, and the road ahead was empty except for fog and darkness, and the ancient forest pressing in from all sides, full of secrets that numbers could never quite explain. 3 years later, Derek Holloway would resign from the National Park Service and become a professor of folklore and anomalous phenomena at the University of Washington, teaching students that the line between natural and supernatural was more permeable than science liked to admit. He would return to the Hoh River Trail every October 18th without fail, and sometimes he would find small offerings at the memorial, flowers, incense, photographs of other missing women from other forests, left by families who'd never gotten closure. He would document it all, measure what could be measured, believe what his instruments could not, and on nights when the temperature dropped without explanation, when fog moved with intention, when he heard whispers in languages he didn't speak, Derek would remember Sayuri Matsumoto's words. Just because your tools cannot count something does not mean it is not real. Ashley Chen never remembered what happened during her missing 48 hours. Medical examinations showed no evidence of injury, exposure, or assault. She returned to her graduate studies with a lingering unease about forests that she couldn't quite explain, and a recurring dream about a woman in white who sometimes smiled sadly and said, "Wrong face, wrong time, but maybe right choice." Years later, when Ashley had children of her own, She would notice that her daughter avoided mirrors during the new moon, claiming she sometimes saw extra reflections that weren't quite right, and she would think about those missing hours, the gaps in her memory, the feeling of having been somewhere else, somewhere between worlds, somewhere that her conscious mind refused to remember, but that her body knew had been terrifyingly real. The pattern held. October 2019 came and went with no disappearances on the Ho River Trail. October 2029 passed safely. Derek kept his promise, returning every year, speaking Sayuri's name, reminding her of the memorial that bore witness to her story. Whether his visits actually helped or whether time itself eventually diluted even supernatural anger, Derek never knew for certain. But he believed in patterns, in documentation, in the power of names and memory and witness. And late at night, when he reviewed his field journals from that October in 2009, Derek would sometimes see things in his photographs that he hadn't noticed at the time. Shadows that moved independently. Fog that formed shapes too purposeful to be random. And in one photograph, taken at the memorial dedication ceremony, a faint outline in the background that looked like a young woman in white, standing at the tree line, watching. He never published that photograph. Some evidence was meant to be preserved but not shared. Some documentation served its purpose simply by existing, proof for one person that what they experienced was real, regardless of whether anyone else believed it. The Olympic National Forest continued to hold its secrets, and Derek Holloway continued to document them, one impossible pattern at a time. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.